Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining June 23rd, 2022 special meeting of the Richmond Rent Board. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few reminders. Members of the public were asked to submit requests to speak on any item on the agenda, including their name, phone number, and item for which they wish to speak. Make a public comment to cynthia_shaw@ci.richmond.ca.us by 3 p.m. today as described on the first page of the agenda. If you wish to make a comment on any item on the agenda and have not emailed me your requests, you must do so in accordance with the first page of the agenda before the item is called. Requests received via email during the meeting after the deadline to submit comments will be accommodated as reasonably possible and will be limited to a maximum of 1 to 2 minutes, depending on the number of commenters as more fully described in the Rent Board meeting agenda procedures. This meeting is being conducted as a Zoom webinar. Members of the public are considered attendees and will be muted for the duration of the meeting unless called upon during public comment and unmuted by the webinar host. The city cannot guarantee that its network and/or the site will be uninterrupted. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and all statements made during the webinar will be on the public record. The first item on the agenda is Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge of allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America,
You guys hear me?
and to the republic for which it stands.
Oh my God,
nation,
everyone went mute.
God,
I can't hear you.
indivisible, with
I pledge
liberty
of
and justice
allegiance to
for
the
all.
flag of the
justice
United
for
States of
all.
America. I can't hear anyone. What happened? Why everyone laughing?
Are you having
We
issues?
can hear
with your-
you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you not hear me?
It delayed
Oh,
for a
yes.
second, I think.
Can you
So we
hear
can-
me?
Yeah, we
Yes.
I
can.
can't hear you.
Uh-oh. Okay, give us a
I don't
second.
know what happened, but I can't hear anyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I hear you now. I'm sorry, I don't know
Okay.
what happened. I just couldn't hear you. Okay. Pledge of allegiance to the flag. I pledge.
We did it already. If you don't have, yeah,
Yeah, we did it.
yeah, we did it.
Sorry.
We're good.
I didn't hear you guys. I'm sorry.
It's all good. We did it. You were done.
Thank
Madam
you.
Clerk, would you please call the roll call?
Yes, thank you. Now I'm having tech issues, right? Okay, Board Member Connor,
Present.
Board Member Johnson,
Present.
Board Member Vasilas,
Present.
Vice Chair Mishek,
Present.
and Chair Finley.
Here.
Executive Director Nicholas Traylor,
Here.
Deputy Director Fred Tran,
Present.
and General Counsel Charles Oshanuga.
Here.
For the record, Staff Attorney Palomar Sanchez is absent. Okay, the next item on the agenda is Statement of Conflict of Interest. Are there any? Hearing none, the next item on the agenda is Agenda Review. Are there any changes to the agenda?
Any changes to the agenda from the board? From the staff?
No.
Thank you.
Okay, hearing none, the next item on the agenda is Public Forum. Tonight, we have no speakers for Public Forum.
Next item, please.
Item on the agenda is item F1 to receive. Item next F1 under study session. Item F1 is to receive a presentation and study the maintenance of net operating income standard and provide staff direction on possible amendments to Rent Board Regulation 905. There are 4 speakers on this item.
All right, good evening, Chair Finley and members of Rent Board, Charles Oshanuga, General Counsel.
Mr. Ocean, I don't believe, I can't hear you.
Oh. Is this better? Can you hear me better now?
Still very light in my area. How about everybody else?
There's
I can hear you fine, Charles.
I
I can hear you, but if you could maybe just get a little closer to the microphone, that might help.
Virginia, did you turn up your volume on your computer?
Let me check.
Okay. We're all having sound issues today, it seems like.
Okay,
You hear better?
go ahead, Mr. Oshanuga. I'll figure it out.
Testing. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yes. I hear
Still
you.
bad for me. Somebody help me with this, can you please?
Okay, you're on your laptop or iPad?
Well, I may have turned down my laptop, and that is probably the problem. Will you give me a moment to leave and to turn up my laptop and then come right back?
Yeah, that's fine.
Go ahead.
Okay, be right
Would
back.
you like us to start the presentation or wait for you?
Would you mind waiting for just a second? If I can,
Sure,
I will
no
get right
worries.
back to you.
No worries.
No worries.
It was a little light for me too.
Oh, can you hear me, Board Member Johnson?
Yeah, barely.
Okay.
Oh, well, I hear you fine, Charles. I don't know about everybody else. Does everybody else hear him fine?
Pretty faint for me as well.
Oh, wow.
Fine for me, but I turned my laptop all the way up.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did too.
Yeah, it sounds fine for me.
Yeah,
But some,
Shiva is fine too. Mhm. Fred, if you could turn it on presenter view.
Okay.
Maybe I could turn on my mic somehow. I'm not sure how to do that. But
well, it might be just a matter of getting closer to the mic, but I don't know.
I'm pretty close.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect.
All right. Let me see if I can figure it.
Well, it sounds like Chair, can you hear now? Is that better?
Mr. Oshanuga, you're the only one. Would you say something, sir, so I can judge that?
Testing.
Very good. Thank you. I'm fine. Thanks
Okay.
for your patience.
What about you, Board Member Johnson? Is that better? Or do
Yeah,
you need?
am I back on camera? I can't tell.
Yes, we can see you.
I'm having tech issues too.
Okay. I think we're all good now.
I think Board Member Vassilas was saying he might not be able to hear me too.
Can you not hear?
No, I can hear you now.
Okay. All right.
Okay, let's try it again then. Good evening, board members and Chair Finley, Charles Oshanuga, General Counsel for the Rent Board. Today we'll be doing a study session regarding fair return and maintenance of net operating income. A few things before we start. First, I'll be looking away. My notes are on a different computer. I was also having tech issues and for whatever reason couldn't open the PowerPoint and Zoom at the same time. So I'm using a different device to read the notes. Secondly, this is a very long presentation. I mean, this is MNOI is not complicated. It just, if you don't know it, there's a lot to know. And I try to condense it the best I can to make it the most succinct. But this really is kind of like a three-part meal all condensed into one. So it's going to be a lot to take in. My suggestion is taking a break halfway through so you can digest the information. This presentation is only important insofar as you and the public understand what's going on. So I'll signal to you, Chair Finley, where I think it's an appropriate time to take a break. And with that, we can move on. Next slide.
Charles, real quick, I want to let the board members and public know that it is posted on our website on our meetings page. So you can, if you want to follow along, you can. So I want to let the public and board members know that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, public, please, if you like, you can go to our website and pull up the PowerPoint yourself, but it's obviously on screen as well. So we're going to begin with, we're going to begin with the background. Next slide. All right, so our first introduction to a landlord's right to a fair return comes in the very first part of the rent ordinance and is captured in its purpose statement. And the purpose statement's right there in front for you all to read. I'll just read it real quickly. The purpose of the rent ordinance is to promote neighborhood and community stability, healthy housing, and affordability for renters in the city of Richmond by controlling excessive rent increases and arbitrary evictions to the greatest extent allowable under California law, while ensuring landlords a fair and reasonable return on their investments and protecting homeowners. So as you can see from the purpose statement itself, there's going to be interplay between the landlord's right to a fair return and the rent board's duties to control rents and arbitrary evictions to the greatest extent allowable by law. And just keep that in the background. That really is the context in which that we all operate. Every regulation, every action is aimed at this regulatory goal and this regulatory purpose to provide that community stability, healthy housing, affordability for renters by means of rent control and eviction control while ensuring a landlord's right to a fair return. Next slide. So the rent board's ability to control rents is necessarily circumscribed by constitutional principles. As it relates to rent control jurisdictions, these principles are satisfied so long as the price controls are not confiscatory. They do not, i.e., they do not deprive investors of a fair return on their investment. And that's just a fancy way of describing the tension that exists in the purpose statement, right? Remember, the purpose statement we just read is you all have the duty, the obligation, in fact, to control rents and evictions to the greatest extent allowable under California law, while at the same time ensuring a landlord receives a fair return. And so another way to look at that is that you can control rents and evictions all the way up into a certain point, right? And that threshold point is this constitutional principle that rents cannot be controlled to the point where a landlord is no longer receiving a fair return. And so knowing where that threshold is the main theme for our discussion. Where does that fair return lie? Next slide. So how do we determine what constitutes a fair return? I think at the last meeting, I can't remember who, but someone mentioned that the courts haven't defined fair return. I'm going to respectfully disagree. I think the courts have, in fact, defined the contours in which you explore what the meaning of a fair return is. And in fact, the courts have been very clear that the fair return concerns the financial integrity of the business as a whole, and not the ability to obtain a return on a discrete portion of the business. On the other hand, the courts have not required a particular methodology be used when evaluating whether or not someone has received a fair return. Rather, the courts have left that up to the jurisdictions. In California, all the rent control and all the mobile home rent controls that I've looked at, they all use the same method of fair return, methodology for fair return. That's the maintenance of net operating income, and the courts have upheld this method as valid, despite there not being one constitutional method that one has to use. So again, how do we determine what constitutes a fair return? We do that first by exploring a methodology, creating a methodology we can use, and within that methodology, having rules we abide by to determine what a fair return looks like for a landlord in the city of Richmond. And just want to reiterate one last time that a fair return, whatever methodology you use, a fair return has to consider the financial integrity of the business as a whole, not a discrete portion of the business. And that's why, something like a separate pass-through for capital improvements that is uncoupled from a fair return, i.e. that does not consider the totality of the whole business's financial integrity, wouldn't be something that we would consider a fair return under law, and certainly not under Richmond's ordinance. Next slide. So, I keep forgetting I gotta move my slides. Okay. So the rent ordinance authorizes the Richmond Rent Board to create procedures and methodologies that permit an individual upward adjustment in rent beyond the AGA to provide a landlord with a fair return, so long as the landlord has demonstrated that the individual upward adjustment is necessary to maintain a fair return. And that's just a fancy way of saying that in the rent ordinance, the voters has authorized the Rent Board to create procedures to adopt a methodology in order to ascertain what it is to receive a fair return, and to then ensure that a landlord is receiving that fair return. But regardless of whatever methodology the rent board chose or were to choose, the rent ordinance specifically limits the board's ability to grant rent increases to only those instances where the landlord has demonstrated the rent increase is necessary to provide the landlord a fair return. And again, you know, you might see in other jurisdictions, you have like a separate process for capital improvements, and it just looks at whether or not you spent money on capital improvements. And if you did, you may be entitled to a rent increase. Those jurisdictions have chosen a policy where perhaps they want to encourage capital improvements. And so when you do a capital improvement, you may be entitled to a rent increase. That's not Richmond. Richmond clearly says that any rent increase that is above the AGA, the annual general adjustment, must be, the landlord must demonstrate that that rent increase is necessary to provide that landlord a fair return, which in turn means that you have to evaluate the financial integrity of the business as a whole, not a discrete portion of the business for purposes of return. Next slide. So again, the rent ordinance allows you to pick this method. Actually, let's start from the top. You know, what's a fair return? What constitutes a fair return? In order to answer that question, you have to figure out what methodology you want to use, right? And the rules you want to create within that methodology. Which methodology do you use? Well, the courts have not said one is required. However, the courts have universally upheld MNOI. They have also rejected other methodologies as circular. I'm not going to get into it. Make this meaning it so much longer. And then, so the rent ordinance allows you to choose whichever methodology you want. The rent ordinance, just like the courts, does not require a specific methodology be used, but whichever methodology you use, a landlord is only entitled to a fair return, a rent increase if they've demonstrated it's necessary for them to receive a fair return on. And so we get to what methodology did we actually end up selecting? And this is kind of a brief historical overview. It's much more involved in this, obviously, but in 2018, the rent board hired Kenneth Barr, the leading expert on fair return as applied in the rent control jurisdictions. Prior to working with the rent board, Mr. Barr had worked with nearly all the sister jurisdictions in California that have rent control and aided them in establishing a fair return methodology. He also testified in numerous court proceedings where his chosen methodology was challenged and ultimately upheld. Mr. Barr's analysis is often cited by the courts. I know this, obviously, because I read these case laws, and you'll find his name in all the major literature when it pertains to methodologies. And so the rent board, I'm not surprised that the rent board didn't pull any punches when trying to figure this out. They hired the best of the best to figure out what methodology to use. Consistent with his prior recommendations as it relates to the other jurisdictions he worked for, Mr. Barr recommended that the rent board adopt the methodology entitled Maintenance of Net Operating Income. And I've said this before, I think it bears repeating, the courts have rejected other methodologies and have routinely upheld the maintenance of net operating income as, it's a typo, as constitutionally valid. Perhaps that's why every jurisdiction I looked at uses the MNOI. Next slide. Now, despite Mr. Barr's recommendation and his background, the rent board, as you all know, because you all sit on it, you're very thorough. The rent board still remained thorough and decided to have staff engage in months of community outreach and workshops, receiving over thousands of comments, suggestions, and several alternative methodologies. Now, I wasn't hired at this time, but when I was hired in the same year, and when I came on board, I worked a little bit with Mr. Barr, and I rewatched a lot of these meetings. They were very long. They were at times very contentious. I know some of the community members who were involved in this and some of the sitting rent board members certainly can describe it better than I can because they were involved in it. But it was a very long process. For those of you who sat on the board for the owner move-in process, when we went out and we collected community input and we received over 4,000 comments and suggestions, the fair return, the MNOI outreach was far more extensive. It dwarfed what we did on OMI. So bear that in mind. So after considering all the community, legal, and expert input, on March 21st, 2018, the Richmond Rent Board adopted the maintenance and net operating income. I'm going to be calling that M&OI, and codified that M&OI process in Regulation 905. Next slide. All right, so we finally get through the history, and we have arrived at a selected methodology, M&OI, but we're still trying to figure out now the question, what is a fair return? So we got our methodology in hand, and we're gonna look at M&OI and see how it describes a fair return. Next slide. So M&OI defines fair return on investment based on a presumption. M&OI presumes that the net operating income received by the landlord in the base year provided the landlord a fair return on investment. And those are terms that I haven't used yet. I will define them, so just bear with me, but not at this time. But the key terms is net operating income and base year. You probably don't know what that means right now, but you will know in a few slides. So long as the net operating income in the base year is maintained and adjusted for 100% of inflation, it is presumed that the landlord is receiving a fair return on investment. So again, a fair return is where you're maintaining the net operating income in your base year as adjusted by inflation. That's what a fair return means. Now, that might not make much sense to you, and if you're confused, that's fine, because I haven't really gotten to the details, but just have that in the back of your mind. Next slide. Okay, so we use the term base year, right? You're maintaining a net operating income in your base year as adjusted by inflation. That's the meaning of a fair return. So let's start with base year. The base year is chosen on the theory that the rents charged prior to the discussions and enactment of rent control provide an accurate approximation of the rents that would be paid in the open market. Taken together, M&OI presumes that the rents landlords chose to charge in a year free from the idea of rent control provided landlords a fair return on their investment, as the rents that were charged were based on general market conditions and not the upward pressure that policy discussions of rent control may have had on the market. So in other words, the base year represents a year in which the idea of rent control had not yet been discussed. So when you set your rents, you didn't set your rents with the eye of rent control. You didn't have that upward pressure. So you set your rents on what your general idea of fair was. And so the M&OI presumes that you know exactly what's a fair return for you, because you know your expenses, you know your income, you know your property. And in 2015, in the base year prior to the discussion of rent control, you were free to set your rents at those levels, whichever levels you want. So once you have those rents set, we're going to presume that in that particular year, you were receiving a fair return. And in the city of Richmond, that year is 2015. Right. In other cities, the years will differ because other cities enacted their rent control ordinances in different years, meaning that the discussion of rent control happened in different years. Some discussions happened in 15, 14, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the reason why we use 15. It is not arbitrary. I think I've heard comments at the last meeting. It's not arbitrary, and it's necessary. It's a very key component of the M&OI. Because of the presumption that is there to validate the idea of a fair return. Okay, so you have in your base year, 2015, you were able to set rents at a level that you wanted to without the upward pressure of the policy discussion of rent control. So you have rents and you have your expenses in that year. So that's very important, base year, very important. Next slide. Okay. So to ensure that year over year, a landlord is maintaining a fair return, the rent ordinance permits a landlord to take a rent increase that is equivalent to 100% of the inflation rate. Now remember, if we back it up a little bit, a fair return, you're presumed to have received a fair return if you are maintaining the net operating income in your base year adjusted for inflation. Okay. Net operating income I haven't explained yet, but I'm gonna get there. In the meantime, your AGA, under the rent ordinance, you can take an AGA, and the AGA is 100% inflation. So presuming you were receiving a fair return in the base year, so long as you've taken your AGAs which mirrors inflation, you should be maintaining exactly what you were making. At the very least, you should be maintaining exactly what you were making in your base year. Of course, you can have turnover, you have vacancies, and then you increase your rents to market. But if you increase your rents to market, nope, keep up, yep. Nope, what? Go back. Go back one more. Yeah, okay, yeah. So of course you can have vacancies and the like, and that gets your rents up to market. But in that case, you're certainly exceeding what you had made in your base year, because your rents are now up at a level that they weren't up at. They're beyond inflation essentially. But despite this device, the AGA device, to make sure that you're receiving your fair return, that's why it's pinged to 100% of inflation. Despite that device, there are occasions where landlords are not receiving a fair return, either because their expenses increased, it wasn't static. The rents may have increased by inflation, but if your expenses outpaced inflation, you would necessarily be making less money over time, and less money as compared to your base year. But we'll get into more of that later. Next slide. Okay, so as mentioned, maintaining the net operating income in the base year is essential to a landlord obtaining a fair return on investment. To determine whether a landlord has maintained the net operating income in the base year, one must first understand the meaning of net operating income and determine the net operating income in the base year. So net operating income is the difference between operating expenses and gross rental income in a given year. All right, so it's not, I mean, it might sound like a lot, but it's not a lot. A net operating income, again, just like it sounds, net, right? Net means the difference of two things, right? So the difference here is your gross income and your gross expenses. Pretty much how much money you made on that property in terms of rent, your gross rental income on that property subtracted by your gross expenses. That result, that number you get from that, is referred to as the net operating income, right? And when you calculate what that number is in 2015, you'll get your base year net operating income. And that's the number you get, that's the number you are to maintain. At the very least, you have to maintain that. That's your floor. You cannot go below that without receiving an additional rent increase. And that number will be adjusted year over year by inflation. It should be adjusted year over year by inflation. And that's what the AGA represents. Okay, and so, this is not that important, but I guess you should know it. So for the purposes of MNOI, certain expenses and income are excluded from the MNOI analysis. A landlord can't include everything when they're trying to determine their net operating income. For instance, in Richmond, if you don't have an individual meter, you can't pass through, you cannot pass through your utilities, right? And so you actually bear all that cost. That's an expense. You can report that expense on MNOI. That's your cost, because you didn't have these individual meters. You pay for everyone's utility, water is rising, we're in the drought. That can be reflected in your costs. However, if you have a sub meter or an individual meter and you pass through utilities to your tenants, i.e. the tenants just pay their own utility, you cannot include that as an expense because the tenants are paying for that. So, I mean, that's an important thing to know, because I know a lot of landlords, they hear that they can't pass through these utilities, garbage, water, whatever it's a utility, and they might be frustrated because utilities rise. But really, you can just do the MNOI. And if it's a large enough increase, you may be entitled to a permanent rent increase. Next slide. Okay. So the net operating income in the base year is the starting point from which one determines whether a landlord is obtaining a fair return on their investment. Once one determines the net operating income in the base year, that income must be compared to the net operating income in the current year. All right. So again, we have the base year is 2015, and we have the net operating income, which is the difference between your gross rental income and your allowable expenses. All right. So that number, that's your base year, 2015, net operating income. Your current year, now you have to get your current year, right? How much in your current year is the calendar year that precedes the year the landlord files the M&OI petition, right? So if you filed your M&OI petition in 2022, your current year is 2021, right? And why? So I think I've heard that in the last, actually that's part of the impetus of us being here today, in fact. Why do we require landlords to file and use the preceding year, right? Why can't a landlord file today and look back at 2018, right? And that's because the fair return, as I said numerous times, the courts have said, and we have said as well, consistent with the courts, that the fair return is concerned with the financial integrity of the business as a whole. And in order to understand the current financial, the financial integrity of the business as a whole, you have to understand the current, the total income and expenses of that business. Well, you're not going to be able to grasp that in the same calendar year in which the M&OI is filed. And that's because the landlord has not fully realized their total expenses nor their total income in the current year. In other words, if you file today, June 23rd, you still have half a year left. You don't know what the total financial integrity of your business as a whole will be. So we look to the prior year where you've already incurred all your expenses and income. And that's your current year. So that's the most recent year we have all up-to-date information on your business as a whole and the financial integrity of your business as a whole. So we take that and we see how your business as a whole is doing in your current year, which is the prior calendar year. And then we compare how your business as a whole is doing in your current year with how your business as a whole was doing in your base year. Right. And it's a property analysis. It's not a landlord to landlord analysis, meaning that the base year doesn't change because the property has changed hands. This is a fair return on an investment. The property is an investment. The property is what's giving you the money. So if you invest it, so, just for instance, if you invested in something that gave you a $4 return, right, and a law was passed and you think, well, I deserve an $8 return because that's what everyone else is receiving. That's not how it works. It's because you came in knowing what the investment was going to yield. And so at the very least, you are to maintain $4. If laws and regulations are passed and you've dipped below your $4 maintenance, then you receive an increase to bring you to that level. So essentially that's what the fair return, the M&OI process is doing. So anyways, you have your base year net operating income, you figure out your your current year net operating income. And so after ascertaining these two figures, you compare them. But before you compare the two, you have to adjust your base year net operating income by inflation. And we said that numerous times before, right? And the reason is $1 in 2015 is not the same as $1 in 2021 or 2022. Just like a quarter in 1910 could buy you a lot more than a quarter would get you today, right? The currency loses value, and it's no different for dollars. So in order for us to be comparing apples to apples, before we compare the 2015 base year net operating income with the current year net operating income, you have to adjust the base year by inflation. And once you adjust the base year by inflation, I know it's a lot, it's called the fair net operating income. And at that point, you can compare your adjusted base year net operating income with your current year net operating income. And finally, when you compare them, if you are not in your current year, if you're not making the same amount or more, you have not received the fair return and you are entitled to a rent adjustment to get you there. So again, the base year is your floor. You cannot dip below that floor. If you dip below that floor, you are entitled to a rent increase. All right. So I'm going to stop there and see if you have any questions.
Real quick, can I make a suggestion if we could hear the public speakers before we go to break? because there's one public speaker who would have to leave, who needs to leave at 6:30.
It's up to the chair. I'm not going to break yet. Just break
Right.
for questions, but it's up to the chair.
I'm sorry, Cynthia, you are asking if we want to hear now from a public speaker?
No, I was just making a suggestion that before we break, if we could hear from the public speakers before we break.
I thought that you had said that there were no public speakers on this item.
No, I said for this item, we have 4. For public forum, we had no speakers. For this item.
Oh, I see. Okay, all right. No, I would prefer to have the public speakers come at the end of Mr. Oshanuga's presentation because they need to hear the whole thing just like we are.
Okay.
I think their questions will be more to the point at that time.
Okay.
Mr. Oshanuga, when you want to resume, please do so.
Sure. Okay, so.
Or if you want to take a quick stop here, that's all right as well. Just, it's in your decision-making process.
Okay, thank you for that. No, I was briefly taking a pause to see if any of you had any questions. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's good to digest. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I don't see anyone. Oh, I see Board Member Vassilas.
Yeah, I just have a quick question on the stuff you just recently covered here. The main one is, why is the base year, I understand the 2015 base year portion of it, the rationale at least for that, but why is the base year for, let's say, capital expenditures and whatnot, not the year in which the property was purchased?
So I guess I don't really understand the question. So let me just answer like this. The base year is the year in which you're going to be establishing the floor to compare all other years into perpetuity, right? So the base year is completely independent from when you incurred any expense. The base year is tied to the presumption, to the constitutionally upheld presumption that when you set your rents free of the pressure of rent control or any discussion of rent control, you set it with your idea of what was fair in mind. And you knew your expenses at the time, obviously. And so whatever you received in your base year is going to be your personal fair return standard. Now, your question, you're asking, why would the base year not shift to the year in which you...
Well, sorry to interrupt. Just it's more so for capital expenditures. So if you're trying to judge your own investment, it would seem logical that your base year would be the year in which you made that investment, which would be the year that you purchased the property, not in a year that someone else owned the property with maybe different renters and a whole different set of numbers. And this is primarily, like I said, for capital expenditures when you're analyzing your investment.
Right. So when you purchase a property after rent control, you know rent control exists, right? And you know your investment, if it's subjected to rent control, you know it's subject to rent control. You also know, I mean, you should, the courts presume you know, even if you don't know, the courts are not very swayed by ignorance. The courts presumes you know of all these things. And you know what your investment under a rent control scheme would yield, not what you think it ought to yield. And so the base year doesn't turn on the individual investor, it turns on the investment, the thing you're investing in. And if this thing is giving yields that are controlled by rent, that's your, I suppose that's your risk as an investor.
No, I understand that, but I'm just saying that you could have, we're going by, it's going to 2015 as the floor, but when you buy the property, it should be the floor as your base for your NOI. Right? Because let's say, you know, it's 2040 and we're going to go back to 2015 and look at potential rent numbers and figures from 25 years prior, and that's the floor. I mean, that doesn't really make any sense to me.
Right. I mean, that's the methodology, I suppose.
Do you understand what I'm saying, that how that can be problematic?
I mean, I disagree, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, explain, so if, let's say there's a whole new set of renters, rental rates, cost basis, why would 2015 be relevant in 2040?
Because it's the regulatory scheme. So the right to a fair return. So in non-rent control jurisdictions, fair return doesn't come up, right? And it's because you don't have a government regulatory scheme that's impacting your ability to collect rents, right? And so when the government steps in, the date that the government steps in is the relevant date in which the fair return constitutional principles attach. And that is when it was passed, right? And so we consider at that date. Now, if you can demonstrate that the regulation is suppressing rents to the point where this property was no longer receiving a fair return, then you're obviously entitled to a fair return. But if you have a bunch of turnover, let's just assume you have a bunch of turnover on your property, all your rents are at market for whatever, at that point, you're an investor, you come in, you buy the place, you don't raise rents as much, right? You don't raise rents at all. You own the place for 10 years and then you sell it to someone else. That's not the government regulation at that point impacting your ability to receive a fair return.
If I buy a property, in a couple of years, I would be entitled to, regardless of who's in there, what tenants are in there and the rental rates, I'm entitled to my 3% or whatever it might be AGA every year, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So long as that's keeping up with my base, I will not be entitled to a fair return CapEx potentially in the future, right? But if it exceeds that, if my initial base NOI is deteriorating over time, I should be entitled to a fair return based on my initial NOI, not an NOI from decades ago.
No, that's just not how it works. I mean, again, the courts have looked at this and they say you're in a heavily regulated industry. When you bought the property, it was already being regulated, and you understood that the regulation date, or at least the method to use, capped your rents at a certain rate, right? And so as an investor, you take a risk, right? And what an investor thinks they ought to receive versus what they are constitutionally entitled to receive are two different things. And the courts have decided that it's appropriate to have your base year in whatever your base year is, despite the fact that you might have bought the property decades later. I think the courts have heard similar arguments and were very unsympathetic, namely because it's a very regulated industry. It was regulated at the time, and you're presumed to know it was regulated, and so you understand the risk you take on your investments.
Yeah, I mean, I get the before and after. I'm just looking down the line here. So basically, what this is saying is that if you buy a property in the future, you will essentially never be allowed any fair return petition.
No, what this is saying is, if you're not maintaining your net operating income, you can obviously get a rent adjustment.
From 2015.
For 2015, exactly. So the courts have considered what you're kind of implying, which is, I didn't want to get into it, but it's the methodology is called fair return on value. And fair return on value, I can send you the case, it's a Vega case for anyone listening as well. Essentially, the court said it's circular and it undermines rent control jurisdictions, and they've rejected that methodology that you're talking about over and over. And it essentially says that we shouldn't be just looking at base rents. We should be looking at value, because value changes from time to time, and you should be maintaining your value on the property. In 2030, your value is going to be significantly different than what it was in 2015. And so you should be getting rent increases that reflect your value. The court said, no, that's not going to work, because that is too circular, because the goal of rent control is to actually control your rents to a level where it's affordable. If it tracked value, and if you were always allowed to increase your rents to match value, it would blow a hole into rent control, because value is determined on rents primarily. That's how properties are valued. So you would always be entitled to an additional rent increase over the AGAs as value always changes and necessarily must track rents.
I mean, I understand the circularity portion. So I'm not saying that someone's going to buy a property down the line and say, oh, I paid too much, my rents need to be increased. I'm just saying in particular for something like capital expenditures, under the way we have it set up here based on 2015, let's say they spent a ton of money and it's above, you know, their NOI is now degraded. Because it's been so long, they are not going to be allowed to have any sort of fair return upward adjustment of rent, potentially, most likely.
Yeah, if you bought a property today and next year, and let's just say this year you did a bunch of capital improvements, are you saying next year if you file MNOI, you may not be entitled to a rent increase because you're comparing it to 2015 levels?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. That's the maintenance of net operating income. You know, I think if you, I could tell you from just practical experience that I think all capital improvement petitions have been, or all MNOIs that had capital improvements in them have been granted by the rent program, except for one. I think it was just a technical issue. Typically, your like capital improvements cost a lot, and when you're tracking your expenses, and if all things remain the same, let's just imagine 2015 to present day, your rents, you've taken every AGA, and let's just imagine your expenses have remained the same. If you do a capital improvement, you would be entitled to a rent increase. So, and that holds true for any period of any time, right? Like, and even if you didn't do a capital improvement, by the way, if you bought a property and it just cost you a lot to, maybe the property was like just worn down, the prior landlord didn't take care of it, and you come in, and maybe the things you were doing to the property didn't constitute a capital improvement, they would constitute an expense. And so if your rents remain the same, adjusted for inflation, if your expenses increased and you're a new landlord or the same landlord, you would be entitled to a rent increase.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that we're going over this because these are some of the problematic portions of MNOI. Because the way I see it, it's really to ensure that over a longer period of time, no capital expenditures can be recovered by a future landlord.
Yeah,
I find that if we're looking at, you know, all the essence of this ordinance, healthy housing, all of these different things, it's just like, is that really what we want, is to have a gotcha where, well, someone 30 years ago had one vacancy and now you're never going to recoup any of your costs to maintain or improve, not maintain, but improve the building. I mean, is that really what we're searching for here?
I mean, to that, I would just respond, you know, on a practical level, no landlord has been denied, except for the one on the technical issue in terms of landlords who submitted MNOIs that included capital improvements. I don't expect a landlord to be denied if you have, if your expenses remain the same and your income's tracked inflation, if you do capital improvements. But aside from that, if you want a separate, if you're saying we need a separate process, just decoupled entirely from a fair return, yeah, other jurisdictions have that, 100%. You know, Oakland has that, and Berkeley has that, Santa Monica has that, but that's all in their ordinance, and you need to amend your ordinance to include that. The voters, or whoever wrote the ordinance, and then the voters approved it, they did not include that. But yeah, that would separate the two.
I mean, you could also say that if capital expenditures was appropriately integrated into fair return, then it would be maybe not the way that we have it set up, but it would be included.
They are included.
Right. I'm just saying the way we have it set up, we can alter it so that it's not decoupled, but it's different than what we have currently, potentially, and have it fit the parameters of the ordinance. Technically.
I'm unsure, but I'll leave that up to all your genius minds to brew on that.
Okay. If anyone else has questions, I've spoke too long here.
I also just want to mention quickly that over time, because we have vacancy decontrol in California.
Mr. Trader, would you get a little closer to your microphone, please?
Thank you. Yes, I
Thank
also
you.
wanted to mention because of vacancy decontrol and the ability of landlords to reset rents to market when there's a turnover of tenancies. After certain number of years, landlords are achieving a fair return because of that. I think that's another factor that you have to consider is that after 10 years or 15 years, as you're talking about 2040 or 2030, by that time, there is usually a good number of turnovers tendencies by that time. So, and that does affect this analysis.
Right. I mean, I think just for some background on this issue, I mean, as we know, Richmond passed rent control. It had been a long time since it had been passed in California. And 2015 was chosen as the base year. And that was just a couple of years like into a recovery from one of the biggest downturns, as we know, economic downturns in our nation's history. And I would argue Richmond was probably hit harder than any other city in the Bay Area. So as we came out with that, over the course of time, and I know for myself, family, friends, colleagues, we were in a situation where landlords hadn't increased rents for maybe a decade. And when this ordinance came along and went into effect in 2017, the rent rules were rolled back to 2015. And many landlords, I'll probably argue a majority of them, were stuck at rent levels to start off with MNOI that were probably 50% of market or just severely below market. So when, I think Mr. Oshinuka alluded to it, when these proceedings took place, back in 2017 in terms of fair return, even Ken Barr himself, has said that one of the greatest weaknesses of MNOI is if you start at a severely below market rent. So where we talk CapEx, where we talk, historically low rents, a lot of these different factors that weren't discussed back in 2017, I think it's worth revisiting. I mean, we're revisiting it now, but these are very deep, very important issues in our city. And they weren't discussed back then. They weren't dealt with back then. I think it's time to do it now. So I don't want to continue to talk too long, but this is a very complicated situation.
No, I think your points are, I actually appreciate it. I think the point of all this is a study session is not for me to talk at you, right? Talk with you. And I appreciate everything you said. I will say what you just said, actually, you said it wasn't really discussed back then. It actually was, and it's actually incorporated in this regulation. And there's actually a process for landlords to adjust their base year amounts higher than what it otherwise be set at. And we've actually done that for landlords in the past. We've had appeals on that. And I'm actually going to get there as well. So there's a huge section when we talk about what you're just talking about, which may alleviate some of your concerns, not all of them, but may alleviate some of your concerns with it. But I really 100% I'm being genuine. I really do appreciate your questions because it's important. It's a matter of public concern. And I invite anyone to ask questions because that's the purpose of this entire meeting right now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Oshinuga, if I may, I was around when we discussed this at great length and the learning experience of all of this. Matter of fact, now it seems far more comfortable the second time around. But if I remember correctly, wasn't the base year established?
I think she froze.
Yeah.
Chair, if you can hear her, she froze.
And my screen is frozen. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we hear you now. We didn't hear you. You froze.
Okay. My question was the base year of 2015 written into the original legislation that established the need for a rent board or the setting up of a rent board?
I think it was in like the voters pamphlets, but it was not in the, it's not in the rent ordinance. Well, no, let me take that back. It's your base rents are in the ordinance, and it is July 2015. The reason you roll your rents back to July of 2015 is because it coincides with the base year. They want you to have your rents to reflect a time in which there was not upward pressure to increase your rents. So the rents you were receiving at that time, landlords were receiving July 21st, 2015, those rents were better reflective of general market conditions rather than upward pressure of rent control discussions. Because once you start discussing rent control, people start jacking up their rents. So that's the purpose of the rollback. And you're right that 2015 is the base rent, and that is exactly why we have it as the base year as well. They're connected.
All right, so that wasn't an arbitrary decision that we made. That was a decision that was gifted to us, if you will, by the legislation.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's right.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to be sure that I was right on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
And I don't have Miss Connor on my screen. Is Cynthia Smith? How's Miss Connor doing over there?
I'm here.
Okay. Would you like to say anything, Miss Connor, at this point in the presentation?
No, I'm gonna fact check quietly.
Okay. We look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Oshanuga.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. All right, so let's go to slide 15. All right, okay, so let's get an example of what we just talked about. Next slide. So this is a slide that's been used over many years, the rent programs, and some of you are familiar with it. So why reinvent the wheel? We can just do it right here. So you have a landlord, and the landlord has a 4-unit building, and each unit is paying $1,400. Next slide. So again, the M&OI calculation begins by examining the base year net operating income and operating expenses. All right, so we got to figure out what the base year net operating income and expenses are. Next slide. This slide is just providing you with, it says definitions, but not really what is expenses that you can include and expenses that you're not able to include as operating expenses. Next slide. So in this hypothetical, let's just imagine that this landlord's expenses in her base year is $20,160. That's just a pie chart to make it look a little bit more pretty, but the total number on the bottom right is the most important number. Okay, so that's your total expenses in your base year. And on a practical level, how this would work is a landlord comes in, they fill out our petition form. On the petition form, there's a page for you to list your allowable expenses. You put all those numbers in, and then you attach your evidence, and that's really just your receipts. And the hearing examiner goes through a pile of receipts and tax returns and evidence and et cetera, et cetera. And some expenses you report, you're unable to demonstrate because you don't have the receipts from, so it doesn't work, and that gets knocked out. Most you are able to demonstrate, especially because your tax return you have to form the Schedule E, and that shows total rents. And if you reported any deductible expenses, we can get it that way. There's a lot of ways for you to prove up your own expenses. So that's just a practical level. It takes a long time. It takes not a long time, but it takes. We only have one hearing examiner. He does an excellent job, and it takes a lot of his power to go through these receipts one by one. Okay, so in this example, your expenses are $20,160. Next slide. Okay, and so let's go with the slide after this. Next slide after this one. So we have your total expenses at $20,160. Remember, it's a 4-unit building. Each unit pays $1,400, right? So you just take the money that you make from the 4 units in a month. That's 1,400 times 4, right? So whatever that number is, that's your monthly income, and you multiply that by 12, and you get $67,200. So that's your gross rental income all right, in your base year, and that's your expenses in your base year. When you subtract the two, you get your base year net operating income, which in this case is $47,040. So that's your base year net operating income. All right, next slide. So let's assume that we fast forward to 2021 and your rents have increased by AGA by $210. So now each unit is paying $1,610. And you want to file a petition, so you file one in 2021, so your calendar year is 2020. So there's been 5 years of inflationary period, right? And that 5 years again comes from your base year, which is 2015, and the current year, which is the preceding calendar year in which you file. You filed in 2021, so your calendar year, your current year is 2020. All right, next slide. And so let's just assume here that, or not assume, but your gross income would be the same math. You take the 4 units, you multiply it by 1610. That gives you your monthly rental income on the property. You multiply that by 12 and you get 77,280. Let's just assume your expenses have increased. All right. And now your expenses are $26,275. You subtract the 2, you get $51,005. That's your current year net operating income. So it's pretty straightforward, simple enough. Next slide. So to maintain a fair return, a landlord's current year net operating income must be equal to or greater than their base year net operating income. Because remember, the base year is the floor. You cannot go below that floor. So in 2015, your net operating income is $47,040. And in 2020, your net operating income is $51,005. Is the landlord maintaining a fair return? If you just compare the 2020 with the 2015, you're making a lot more in 2020. So you've not only met the floor, you've exceeded the floor. So you are maintaining a fair return, and you are not entitled to a rent increase. But that's actually the incorrect answer, because you have to first adjust your 2015 levels by inflation. If you just compare them like it is, you're not comparing apples to apples, right? So just like that 1910 quarter, we have to make sure that quarter in 1910, whatever the dollar amount is, it's added to the quarter value, right? And so, next slide. So what you do is you adjust for inflation. There's been a 5-year period from 2015 to 2020. Let's just assume that inflation is 15%. That's what the inflationary period was. What you do is you take 15% of $47,040, and you get a result, and that's the inflation amount. Then you take that result and you add it back to $47,040, and you get a total of $54,096. And that's your adjusted base year net operating income. We refer to that as the fair net operating income. But that's essentially your base year net operating income adjusted by inflation. You don't have to be too savvy with the math, but just know that there's math done and that the inflation is then built in. So next slide. So now what you're comparing is, instead of comparing that 47,000 to 51,000, now you're comparing your $54,000, which is your base year, your adjusted base year net operating income. You're comparing that $54,000 to the $51,005, which was your current year net operating income. And when you do those two comparisons, you realize that you're not maintaining a fair return. Because again, your floor is $54,000, and in your current year, you're only making $51,000. So you have to adjust, so when you compare the two, you're not meeting your floor, you're underneath your floor. So you are entitled to a rent adjustment, and the difference is approximately $3,091. So you're entitled to a rent adjustment in that amount, but that amount needs to be reflected. That's an annual amount that needs to be reflected monthly and then spread across your units. So you take that amount, you divide it by 12, which is the months, so then you get your monthly amount, and you divide that by 4, which is the per unit amount, and it ends up being a $64 rent increase per unit. That's permanent. That goes on forever until the tenant moves out, obviously, and then you can reset the rent however you want. The hearing examiner, after giving the award, looks to see how much of an increase that that rent increase would be on the tenant. And here it's just a 4% rent increase. However, we do that, we look to see the percentage of increase because the board has adopted a cap of 15%. You cannot increase the rents via MNOI by more than 15%. So if you got a 20% rent increase award via MNOI, you could take the first 15, the other 5 has to be taken later. And it's cumulative, by the way. So if you took an AGA, like the AGA this year is on the 5.5% or something.
Mhm.
So that adds on to your, that's taken into account when we consider the 15% cap. So in this year, you'd only be able to take a 9.5%. And in the following years, you can take the remainder. All right, so that's that slide. Now at this time, next slide. Now, this is the time I was gonna say we might wanna take a break. It gets pretty involved in the next few slides. I can go on, I don't really mind, it's not for me, it's for you all if you wanna sit back and digest it, but if you all wanna keep going or if you have questions, either way.
Well, we've been in session for just over an hour and 5 minutes at this point. Let's hear from each of you if you want to continue, or would you like to take a quick break?
Board Member Connor has her hand up.
Ms. Connor.
So before I ask my question, I will say that if I heard Ms. Shaw correctly, we have a member of the public who can't stay on the call beyond 6:30. So you may want to take that person so they can share their comments. I'm fine with continuing, but I did have a question on this calculation once you've heard from the rest of the board.
All righty. Ms. Shaw, I did not hear that reference to a speaker. And yes, in that case, we will hear her. But let's determine whether we're going to take a break first. Ms. Johnson, I see your hand.
Go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
Sorry, I'm having technical problems, sorry.
Okay, so your hand is not up?
Yeah, it is, but I was.
Oh, it is, okay.
So my question is, I heard it said that the annual rent increase is reflected in what the rent increase the landlord is seeking? Is that correct?
No, it's reflected in the cap. So you know, if a landlord receives a rent increase award of an amount that's greater than 15%, because we have a 15% cap, the landlord cannot take the entire award at once. They can take up to 15, and then they defer the rest to the following year. And what
So for this year, for example, the rent increase was 5.2%. So how does that reflect on what the landlord's trying to get?
So if the landlord was, let's just say hypothetically, the landlord received a 20% MNOI rent increase adjustment, right? There's a 15% cap, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so the question is, how does the landlord get to the cap? And here in this jurisdiction, we consider the AGA as adding on to the cap. So a landlord can take, of course, the AGA, they can always do that, the 5.2, and then the difference between 15% and 5.2, that remainder, the landlord is also entitled to take. The rest of that is deferred to the following year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else like to speak at this point? In that case, we will take a 5-minute break. It's
Are we taking a break? Board Member Connor said she's willing to go forward. You want to see if everyone else is ready to go forward? And we take the public comment.
what I was going to say is we will take a 5-minute break, come back, hear the public comment, and then continue. Does that work for everybody? Mr. Oshanuga?
Connor, you're saying something we can't hear. I think board members Connor said that's fine, but I think you need you need to vote on it, but it could just be a, it doesn't have to be a roll call. You can just aye, nay, you can call a vote, and if everyone says aye, it's fine.
Call a vote for the break?
Yeah, I mean, if that's what you guys are wanting to do.
It's up to you.
Okay. Does anybody not want to take a 5-minute break? Put your hand up at this point.
You said not take a break?
Not take a break.
I'm fine with not taking a break.
Okay, in that case.
Oh, Board Member Connor said no break. Johnson, do you want a break?
I'm sorry, Ms. Connor, I saw your hand go up and then down. Are you saying yes to a break or no to a break?
I'm fine with not taking a break. So I'm voting no break. Let's keep going.
Okay. Mr. Vasilas,
I could keep going.
Ms. Johnson,
I guess I don't want to be outvoted, so we can just keep going. If-
Ms.
I'd like a
Lucia,
break,
I'm not sure
but
you would be outvoted, but
yeah,
Ms. Lucia,
I would like a 5-minute break, but I mean, I'm okay to keep going if everyone else is. I
Don't
don't want to.
Don't
I don't
get
need to die
bullied,
on
Board
this
Member Johnson. Don't get bullied. You vote
hill.
vote the way you want to vote.
Well, I'd like to take a break then.
okay. And I'm also going to suggest that we take a 5-minute break. It is now 11 minutes after 6. We will reconvene at 16 minutes after 6. And then we will hear from the public speaker. Thank you. We're going to reconvene. Will everyone please adjust their videos and unmute their microphones? Mr. Oshanuga, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Mr. Trailer, are you with us? Ms. Shaw, would you be good enough to call the speaker, please?
Okay, sure. Do you want me to start from the first person or just let the speaker that has to leave at a certain time?
Let's go ahead with the first person. And then the other speakers, unless there is a time frame that we need to worry about, we'll go at the end of the presentation. Again, Mr. Oshanuga's information is important for all to hear.
Okay, so we have 4 speakers and we only have, so I can let the first 2 go first, if you like.
Oh,
Okay.
hold on. Cindy, I think the chair was saying let the one with the time restriction go,
Okay,
and then the
okay.
rest go at the end.
That's
Oh.
correct.
All right, thank you. All right, let me get my timer together. All right, the speaker is Elizabeth Kohler, and let me let her speak. Elizabeth, are you on? I'm gonna see if I can share my screen with the, oh, I can't share, but anyway, I'll let the timer. Elizabeth, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm getting ready to set the timer. I'm just gonna set another time. Oh, you're gonna let me share? Okay, thank you, Fred.
I can stop sharing.
It's okay. Okay, I'll go ahead and share. 1 second, Elizabeth. I have to share my screen with the clock. Okay. You can go ahead.
Okay. So I am a property owner in Richmond, and I actually went through this NOI process, specifically for capital improvement, but ended up having to go through the whole process. And actually this presentation was interesting because now I understand why. I don't agree with it, but I understand. But my point is this process is so difficult. I mean, I am a college graduate. I, work a lot with numbers. I have done a lot of this kind of thing, capital improvements in other areas, but this was by far the most difficult process I have ever used. And just to let you know, I have over an inch of paperwork with receipts and copies of check registers. I just can't see how somebody who isn't, perhaps somebody who is an immigrant, like my parents, for example, they would never, ever be able to do this process. It would be much too difficult. And I did receive help from the people at the rent board, but it really wasn't very much. So anyway, I just wanted to let you know that this process, although you have it, is not a workable process for a lot of people. And so they don't even try. And I think that you should consider that when you're thinking about making revisions to the NMOI process, because it took me months personally, and then whatever the time it took working with the people at the rent board. So anyway, if someone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Cindy, you're muted.
All right, I don't see any questions for the speaker. Mr. Vasilis, you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. I don't know if she had answered it, but how long would you say the process took from start to finish?
Hold on, let me see if I can unmute her.
I'm sorry, from when I first filled out the form until I got my, whatever it's called, the notice of decision, I would say that it was, oh gosh, 6 months, maybe more. I would have to look at some of the paperwork, but it was a very, very long time. Because you have to, I mean, the documentation is unbelievable. So, and then again, waiting from when I submitted it until I got my information. And unfortunately, I got my decision right before COVID, and so I couldn't do the rent increases until, you know, the moratorium was lifted, but nothing I could do about that. So it's just an incredibly complicated and difficult process.
All right.
And
Thank you.
considered.
Thank you. Shall we proceed then, Mr. Oshanuga?
Sure. Can I ask a quick question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Now I see Ms. Mishak also has a question.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, I have a question for the speaker as well. Was the petition that you filed eventually granted? And if so, for how much?
You should be able to speak. You should be able to unmute. There you
Yes, it was granted, and it was granted for $208 per unit per month.
And how many units?
2.
2. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Board Member Connor has her hand up.
Oh, Ms. Connor, thank
My
you.
question is for Mr. Oshanuga, so I don't want to hold up any questions for the speaker or speakers.
Okay.
All right, we'll come back to you. Thank you. Ms. Johnson, I see your hand. Thank you, Cynthia.
Yeah, my question is also for Mr. Oshanuga.
All right, thank you. Then let us proceed. Let's go back to Ms. Connor for the first question for Mr. Oshanuga, then we'll come back to you, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. I want to make sure I'm not impeding a public speaker who has to leave. So I was just going to check with Ms. Shaw to make sure I'm not speaking.
That was the speaker who has to leave.
Okay. All right. So Mr. Oshanuga, I was trying to follow your conversation with Board Member Vasilas, and I don't think I did. But my question is, if the base year is 2015 and Mr. Vasilas owns that building for 10 years, and then I buy it from him in 2025, I don't have any base year expenses because I didn't own the property then. So how do I submit my MNOI with my base year numbers, but didn't own it? I didn't have any expenses in 2015 because I didn't own it, and he's not going to give that to me 10 years down the line.
So I'll answer two ways. The first way you may not like, but the second way you're gonna like. So, you know, arguably, well, maybe you'll like the first way, but arguably, you haven't yet incurred a fair return potential violation because you haven't yet started making money on your investment. You haven't received your incomes, you haven't received any expenses. So your right to fair return hasn't been elicited. I mean, that's what I would say in court, right? That's the position I have in court. However, the way you might like is, the regulation, it doesn't anticipate your specific example because I think it holds my position. But if you don't have your base year expenses, there is a regulation, I'm gonna go through it, it's towards the end of the presentation, that allows you to project your base year expenses based on your current year expenses. But you have to have some kind of expenses to do that projection.
I just used the wrong year. I should have bought it in 2020 and wanted to file my thing 2023, but math's not my strong suit.
no worries. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. And then we can get into a little bit more detail if you like further down the road. In this
I think the further down the road answer is the answer I'm looking for.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yep.
Ms. Johnson.
Yeah, I'm about to say Johnson.
Oh, I'm sorry. Were you finished?
No, you did it, Johnson.
So,
Okay.
so I might be jumping the gun, but my question is, why was the process, why is it so difficult?
So I can't speak for any individual because I think the way I think and people think the way they think. I'm not sure what their idea of difficult is. So I'll give an answer, but you should take it with a grain of salt because difficult is subjective. And I don't see the process as difficult. I do see it as one that requires a lot of information. I think objectively that's accurate because it's dependent on the financial integrity of your business as a whole. And so you're going to be submitting all the proof of all the income you received and proof of all the expenses you incurred. And that's going to, depending on how many units you have, that could be a lot of information. I mean, for the lady who just spoke, she has, it seems like 2 units. And if you've never gone through the process and perhaps you're not used to business, you're not that business savvy, maybe you don't keep your documents as segregated as one who would otherwise keep it. They are engaged in multiple businesses. That process might be shocking. It might be, oh, what the heck? I'm not used to this. I just collect rents, I pay my bills, and that's it, right? So for the layperson, it may be a little bit more shocking. Ironically, the more units you have, the more information. If you have like a 10-unit building, it's a lot of documents. However, those landlords are more sophisticated, and so the process is more seamless in a weird way with them because they have a lot of accounting to do, they have a lot of taxes to file, so they've already got all their documents in lines, and they often, it's been my experience that they have other business ventures that require the kind of documentation that we require, and so it's just a matter of duplicating the documents. And I can't speak for that particular individual or people generally, but I would just say it does require information on your business, and that could be a lot of documents. And if you're confused, just generally, it's math too, and math can suck, so that can be hard. And I know for a fact some petitioners, some landlords have gotten very upset with the program, where we try to explain to them that your numbers mathematically are inaccurate, so we're going to have to put the accurate number in the box, and they've complained to the rent board about that, to you all about this. So we stopped doing that. So we just tell them it's inaccurate. You can keep the inaccurate numbers in there, and we'll just point it out in the decision. So it's a lot. It's a lot to deal with. But ultimately, like I said, 90+% of these petitions are granted. I think the lady who spoke, her petition was granted in the amount of $200 and something. If your rent's $2,000, that's equivalent to 10 point something rent increase. That's way more than you would receive. She said it was before COVID, so that's what, 2020. 2020's AGA is like 3%. So that's about 3 times what you would receive under AGA. So she ultimately reached the finish line. It gives you what you deserve, and sometimes you get a huge. I mean, we had larger awards, way larger than $200, and it's permanent. we've had multiple awards on the same property. That's equivalent to about $600 to $700, maybe around 20 something percent of rent increase, maybe even over 30, 35%. It is just a process there, and they're constitutionally entitled to it. And if they're constitutionally entitled to it, you have no ability to control it. So that's kind of how it works,
Board Member
Thank
Vazquez,
you.
I think he had his hand up. Did you lowered your hand?
I think I'll probably ask my question a little later in the.
All righty, thank you. All right, Mr. Oshanuga, in that case, would you continue with your presentation, please?
Sure. Okay, thank you, Fred. Okay, so we're going to talk about the adjustment of base share net operating income. And before I begin, again, I want to thank you all you board members, all the public, for your patience and listening to this, and the board members for your questions, and the last public speaker for her input. I think all this is important. I also want to thank, before I forget, our hearing examiner, Paul Cohen. It's a lot of work. Like I said, if the petitioners, if the landlords are saying this thing is complicated, it's a lot of work, then, that's just so much more work for our hearing examiner, who handles a bunch of these. And he's the only one who does these in the other cases. So anyways, adjustment of base share net operating income. This is going to speak a little bit to what board member Vasilas had brought up in terms of you being locked in to a lower base year. And I'm going to explain why some of the things that he said. I'm going to give you some clarity as to why it would be problematic to be stuck at a lower level in the base year. So you understand his comments, you can understand what he was conveying when he said that. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is going to be a lot, so bear with me. All right, so recall that the base year presumes that the rents the landlord chose to charge in a year free from rent control provided landlords a fair return on the investment, as the rents that were charged were based on general market conditions. Now, this is the presumption, and when this presumption holds true, you're receiving your fair return in the base year. However, there are those instances where the rents were charged or expenses incurred prior to the enactment of rent control were not based on general market conditions. For instance, rents charged to a close friend or family member may not have been set based on general market conditions, but rather on special relationships a landlord shares with close friends or family members. Perhaps a landlord wants to give a friend a deal on a rental unit because they share a very close relationship and decides to charge rents based on that relationship rather than general market conditions. Or maybe you had huge expenses, right? Maybe some part of your property had burned down, or maybe you had a catastrophe, maybe you want to keep rents low for whatever reason, all sorts of reasons out there. In that instance, the rent charge would not be based on general market conditions, and subsequently the presumption that rents being received during the base year provided landlord a fair return may not be applicable. But to be clear, because I don't want there to be any confusion on the board or in the public, the phrase rents charged based on general market conditions does not stand for the propositions that rents charged must reflect market rate rents for the base year presumption to hold true. Those are the words of the court, not mine. That's a paraphrase. Courts have been clear and consistent in determining that landlords do not, this is a quote, landlords do not have the right to have their base rent adjusted merely by showing that the base rent is below market. In other words, one does not look to the amount of rent charged to determine whether rents were set based on general market conditions. Rather, one looks to the basis by which rents were charged, whether the rents were charged based on general market conditions or other conditions that would constitute an exceptional circumstance. So as we discussed, your base share is being compared, your base share is your floor, and it's compared to your current year. Now, the lower the floor is, the easier it is to meet the threshold of fair return, right? Let me just give you numbers to that, right? If, let's just say in your base year, this will never happen, but let's just say in your base year, you made $50. That's it. That was your net operating income in 2015, $50. You would likely never be entitled to a fair return because it's very likely you're going to be making more than $50 in the subsequent years. That's a very low base year, right? And so because that base year is so low, your fair return is probably never going to work out. Even if you're making $75, which is far way low, it would still be considered a fair return, right? Because your base year was so low. And likewise, you can have a year where your expenses are so high. That's also your expenses is so high, and if your income stays the same, it would lower your base year net operating income, if that makes sense. So it's either, let me back up. Sorry, your base year is a function of your rental income and your operating expenses, right? That's net operating income. And so if your rental income is low, and even if your expenses are just normal, your base year net operating income, the result's going to be a lower base year net operating income. And likewise, if your expenses are high, even if your base year is normal, your rents are normal, you're going to have a lower base year net operating income. And so those are the two things, those are two factors that are considered when understanding whether or not, there was an exceptional circumstance in the base year. Some landlords who are savvy tried to, this is our hearing examiner's job. Some savvy landlords may try to mess with those numbers a little bit, and we have to be careful with it. But that's where that comes from. And I think what Board Member Vasalas was talking about, the weakness of MNOI that Mr. Barr addressed, he's right, but that weakness is addressed in the regulation, because after it was brought up, it was it's part of the scheme, I suppose, of MNOI, part of the methodology of MNOI to cover any weakness, and this is part of it. So next slide. So where a landlord believes that the base year did not provide a fair return, the regulation, it's Richmond Rent Board Regulation 905A, like Apple 5, permits landlords to present evidence to rebut the presumption that the base year net operating income provided a fair return. And there are two avenues by which a landlord may rebut the base year presumption. Number one, the landlord's operating expenses in the base year were unusually high or low in comparison to other years. Or number two, the gross income during the base year was disproportionately low due to exceptional circumstances. And again, that's Richmond Rent Board Regulation 905A5 and B. Since the net operating income is the gross income minus the expenses, the aforementioned avenues are components of the net operating income. And consequently, an adjustment in either expense or income will have an overall impact in your net operating income. Essentially, like I was saying, the regulation considers just these two components, your rent and your expenses, because those two components are going to make up your net operating income. And if as Member Vasalas was saying, is not COVID, but the recession hit, and maybe you're recovering, and you have there was a lot of homeless people there. I mean, there's a lot more now, but it was almost the start of the exacerbation of it all to such an extent. And maybe you have friends or family, or just who you don't even have to know them. Maybe you have a nice heart, and you said, hey, I want to offer you live in my place for lower than you would otherwise receive because of all these circumstances. That might qualify you in terms of an exceptional circumstance, because your gross income, number two, your gross income would be lower. I don't know if it'd be disproportionately lower, there's more to it, but it would be lower than it would otherwise be if we were set at general market conditions. Next slide. Okay, so exception. So we're not going to look at the expenses, because the exceptional circumstance in the base year oftentimes is reflected on income for the reasons we've stated, but there could be exceptional circumstances. And in fact, there is a regulation that covers it, where you have your expenses are way too high. And that could be, whatever you were dealing with in 2015. Like I said, an earthquake, a fire, or however else you dealt with expenses. Maybe you even did a capital improvement. You could have improved your entire building in 2015, right? And that would certainly lower your net operating income, assuming that your rental income stayed at a normal level, or was set at a level set with general market conditions in mind. Okay, next slide.
Board Member Vasalas has his hands up. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah.
Co-chair, is that okay if he asks a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Vasalas?
Yeah, I just want to point out that the way this is set up, is that if you, let's say you had a fourplex with 4 2-bedroom units, if you were charging $500 or $300 per unit in 2015, that was going to be what your rents would be set at probably for the eternity of your ownership, right? Maybe you can go and apply for an MNOI petition, wait in line for 2 years or 6 months or whatever it is to try and get something, but likely you are going to be stuck around that level for the rest of your ownership. And I'm not sure if the rest of the board members got the letter from, I think it was Jerry Doss, about her experience and what is the experience of, I would say, majority of all of the landlords here that had an issue with what was going on. It wasn't about rent control. It wasn't about being able to jack up people's rent. It was that we are starting at such a low level, you are trapped there. And there is very little recourse. And it's the people that are lucky enough to be educated to go through this process and have all their receipts, perhaps they get something from it. But for the, like the woman that said, an immigrant or people who are not savvy, that are scared, that maybe not even know, that's the end, that's it for them. So that's why I say this is so important. And I see this every day. I see buildings where I see them sell for pennies on the dollar from a longtime owner who probably can't afford to keep the building. And I see an investment firm from Sacramento come in that's probably going to buy out all the tenants, displace everyone, jack up the rent, and there we go. We displace the tenants, we've displaced the longtime owner. So when we talk about, the community stability, landlords, small landlords are part of the community here. That's part of the stability as well, right? So all these things need to be taken into consideration when we come up with our regulations. And if we make them too hard, they're not going to be effective. We need to have some sort of balance here to institute. And that's why this is so frustrating for a lot of us, is that when we first came to the rent program back in the day, 9 out of 10 people say, what about my historically low rents, my below market rents? And for months to a year, we were led along saying, don't worry, there's going to be a historically low rent provision that will alleviate some of your concerns. It never happened.
Right. So if I may respond, you're not stuck at $300. The DOSs, as you've mentioned them, they themselves claim a lack of sophistication, and that was part of their complaint with the process. They said they've never done it, that they're from I'm not going to put words in their mouth, they can speak for themselves, but they did it. And they did it, and their rents were not at $300. They were a lot more than $300.
I'm not trying to state that they were 300. I'm just saying technically, unless
Right.
you provide some exceptional circumstances, or that was your friend or whatever, a very rare case, likelihood is you're going to stay around that level. Maybe it's adjusted to $400. Who knows?
Well,
I'm trying to make a point.
Right, I understand that would be the case in any world where you fail to assert your rights. Like, your rents are going to stay what your rents are until you come in and petition. Once you're petitioned, once you go into the process, like the DOSs did, you go through the process, and like I said, more than 90% of these petitions are granted. You are likely to get it granted. Now, the DOSs, actually, the exceptional circumstance that I'm going to go into in more detail right now, they actually applied for that. They got their base year net operating income adjusted, because they said when in 2015 our rents were set low because we had long-term tenants, we wanted them to stay in there, we really liked them. The hearing examiner found, okay, that qualifies, and so they ended up getting the hearing examiner gave them an adjustment of $105 per unit, right? That was about a 10%, 11% rent increase on their units at first, and then they appealed it. And after the appeal, the rent board gave them a $180 rent increase after that. Then following year, they submitted, because after you win and after you demonstrated a need for a fair return, your base year is actually reset. To your point earlier that it stays in 2015, it doesn't. It doesn't. So their base year, the DOS's base year, is no longer 2015. It's the last year in which they were granted their fair return petition. So in the following year, they filed another fair return petition. All right. And in that petition, they alleged the same things, and they were granted another rent increase year over year. And that rent increase, I think, don't quote me, but I think it was around $200 something. All right. And so, I mean, I understand that perhaps we don't like the process, but the process is working. You got it, but you have to be, you know, not you, but, you know, the public has to understand that there are not only just rules in place, but there are just legal standards that we have to follow. And there's one hearing examiner, right? So any delay, I mean, for instance, there are 2 appeals pending on my desk that have been pending for like 3 months. I've been trying to get them done, but as one person who handles all the legal issues and everything else, you know, sometimes things take time. And a hearing examiner does, I don't know, 10 to 15 cases a month.
Not to mention one staff person to help. That's me.
Yeah, with one staff person to help, right? That's a lot. And so it can be, you know, I think some of the delay is a staffing issue, but we can't upper staff because, you know, you up the fees and then you have that tension. So, you know, you have to be careful how we deal with it. I suppose my point is just this. You mentioned the DOS's complaints, so I brought them up specifically because you brought them up. And I think their letter is in, I read their letter to the board as well, speaking about their experiences. And so I want to provide clarity around their experience, but also the last speaker who said it was tough, but she did it. We have individuals who I don't believe their first language is English, who've gone through the process and they've done it. The reason you hire staff like our housing counselors is to have exactly this. If it's too hard, we sit with you. I mean, you might not like the outcome, right, as a landlord, but we sit with you and we try to help you navigate this process. I mean, so I think the idea that the base rent stay the same, that 2015 you're stuck at, it's not how it works. And there are circumstances where if you have rents that were not set based on general market conditions, you can be entitled to a base year net operating income adjustment. And without that adjustment, you know, the DOSs would have lost their case or would have received a very, very small rent increase.
Ms. Johnson, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure I understand. I make sure that this is crystal clear, but I don't understand what the issue is. If you're not getting a fair return on your investment, you are entitled to a rent increase, right?
Yes.
So I don't understand.
So that the problem though is it's all relative. So if you're starting, I mean, this is Ken Barr has said this, that the Achilles heel of MNOI is if you start at a disproportionately low rent. That's the true. And in the testimony that he gave, he's like, oh, well, that's not going to matter because you'll have vacancies and it'll turn over. That's a pretty huge assumption to make. And if your rents are very low to start with, the odds of any turnover are extremely low.
All right. Any additional questions? Then let us proceed. Mr. Oshanuga.
There's Chair Finley, Board Member Connor has her hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see it.
I push it up and put it down. I'm sorry. I did it quick. I was just curious, is there a separate historically low rent petition, or is that also part and parcel of an MNOI petition?
That's part and parcel of the MNOI petition because again, the rent increase, as the ordinance says, you are only entitled to a rent increase above the AGA when you've demonstrated it's necessary to receive a fair return. And a fair return considers the business as a whole. So we have to look at the whole thing. I think Berkeley might have the historical low rent thing, and that's separate. That's not a fair return rent increase. That's just a rent increase. That's a recognition that you may need a rent increase, and their ordinance put that in. Same thing with capital improvements when it's decoupled. It's not a fair return rent increase. It's a rent increase for capital improvements because perhaps the city wants to incentivize capital improvements.
Okay, Mr. Vasilas.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to point out that we did sign or approve a sole source contract for Ken Barr. I think it was an increase of $30,000 back then. And part of that was so he could plan and give us a memo on historically low rents. And that was going to be a big thing to alleviate a lot of people's concerns. It was actually one of the main rationales for passing MNOI as is. I think I remember Chair Maddock at the time saying, well, we're going to visit historically low rents in the future, so let's just pass this now. Once fair return was passed, the rent program had no other legal need to do anything further than MNOI and their fair return, and it was dropped. It was never brought up again. And Berkeley did pass a historically low rent in the early 90s. And it was based on the fact that for a decade of really unfair rent control, a lot of small-time property owners petitioned for the board to alleviate some of their concerns. And one of their main concerns was that they were trapped at severely low rents. So that board, I think it was in the early 90s, made 5 revisions to their rent ordinance or their fair return regulations. One was to change the base year. One was allowed for base rents to be changed based on comparable rents at the time that rent control was put into place. And another was historically low rents that made a quick way in which a landlord could get up to a decent amount of level to start off with their base rents. So you start off, you make it quick, you don't go through a 2-year petition process. You start off at something that the board voted with economists weighing in on it was fair. It wasn't all the way at market, but it was a good starting point. And that board passed all of these things and was sued by the city of Berkeley and a tenants' rights group. And the city of Berkeley lost, and all of those 5 revisions from that board were upheld by the courts. And I think they stated that all of these 4 things were all necessary to eliminate long continued unreasonable delay in terminating confiscatory rental rates in the city and providing a just and reasonable return on investment to the city's landlords. We conclude that the board thereby properly exercised its discretionary authority in accordance with the constitutional mandates imposed on it by the courts of this state, including this court, and did not, by adopting those regulations, abuse its discretion by exceeding the powers granted by its enabling ordinance, which is subject to those judicial mandates. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I have to go back then, Mr. Oceanuga, and ask the same question in a different way. How much of this was incorporated in the proposition that established this board, and how much freedom do we have to actually change what our structure is?
So again, the MNOI, the methodology is up to the rent board to choose.
Okay.
Right? Let's make that clear, right? You chose an MNOI, and MNOI has a particular methods that cascade on one another. Meaning, if you change one, you start changing a bunch of others. Almost like genetics, and your limitation in terms of the ordinance, your limitation is you cannot give a rent increase. Can't create a process that gives a rent increase where a landlord does not demonstrate the rent increase is necessary for them to receive a fair return. And a fair return is a consideration, the Supreme Court, it's a consideration, it's not the Supreme Court, it's a consideration of the financial integrity of the business as a whole, meaning that you have to consider the finances of the business as a whole. All right, and only when considering that, where you've considered that, and the landlord has demonstrated, in light of their financial integrity as a business as a whole, in light of that a rent increase is necessary to bring them to a fair return, do you give a fair return? So that's just a long-winded way of saying, under our ordinance, I don't see how you can uncouple an analysis. You can call it whatever you want, but an analysis that considers the financial integrity of the property as a whole to whatever rent increase you're trying to give. The rent ordinance doesn't give rent increases for the sake of giving them. It only gives them where a fair return is implicated.
Okay, Mr. Vassilas, your
One thing
comment?
just to add to that, and the board has the ability to vote in and decide on what a fair return is.
Yeah, the board can decide the methodology of determining the fair return,
Yes.
and they've done that. Yeah. So you can
Okay.
say, for instance, you can say like a landlord who's not, well, maybe you can't. I don't know. I have to look at that. Okay. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to have to do some more research before I say anything else.
All right. In that, Mr. Vasalas, your hand is still up. Did you have something else you wanted to say?
I mean, I just want to point that out, is that that's one of the main duties of this board, is to determine these things. And these are very, very important things, right? And we do have the freedom to do that. And that's why one of the reasons I brought up that Berkeley case is that's a precedent of factoring all these different things, you know, that community stability, all these things that we need to emulate from what the ordinance wants into the reality. And if we go too far and go too strict on stuff, I just think the outcome is not in the best interest of this program, of this city, of the community.
All right. Now, may we in that case proceed with the presentation?
Yes. Okay, next slide. Oh, did we do this one? Okay, sure. So landlords may rebut the base year presumption by demonstrating that the gross income in the base year was disproportionately low due to the exceptional circumstances. This provision establishes a two-part analysis. First, to rebut the base year presumption, a landlord must demonstrate that an exceptional circumstance served as the basis of setting rents. And this is consistent with court rulings that have held landlords do not have the right to have their base year. I'm sorry, let me read that again. This is consistent with the court rulings that have held landlords, this is a quote, landlords do not have the right to have their base rent adjusted merely by showing that the base rent is below market. Again, kind of in line with what we were just discussing, having low rents doesn't give you the right to adjust the base year. That's not my, those are not my words. That's the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles versus Santa Monica Rent Control Board. That's a court decision. They've considered this argument and they said, no, you don't have that right. However, if you set your rents on an exceptional, based on an exceptional circumstance, so regardless of the amount of rents you receive, if your rents were set on something other than a general market condition, i.e. an exceptional circumstance, then you may have a right to adjust those rents if you meet the second prong, which is a landlord must establish that because their rents were charged based on an exceptional circumstance, the gross income or rents charged in the base year were disproportionately low. All right, so again, historically low rents, that doesn't entitle you to a base year rent adjustment. That's not my words, it's the court's words. Well, the historically part were my words, but the rest weren't. That's the court's words. But you may be entitled to one if you set your rents on something other than an historical circumstance. I mean, a general market condition, sorry. And based on that, your rents and your incomes were disproportionately low in the base year. Next slide. I'm not gonna go through all these factors, but this is as to the second prong in determining whether the gross income in the base year was disproportionately low. The hearing examiner considers the following factors. It doesn't matter if a landlord raises these factors or not. The hearing examiner has to go through all these factors and determine whether or not they're relevant. And the hearing examiner has the right to afford whatever weight they want to in weighing the impact of each factor. But the purpose of these factors is to provide additional insight as to the exceptional circumstance that led to the disproportionately low base year gross income. So one factor, I'll just go through number 3, for instance, the pattern of rent increases in the years prior to the base year and whether those increases reflected increases in CPI. So let's just say your exceptional circumstance is you wanted to set rents low because you like your tenants and you want them to stay, right? And that's 2015. You fast forward to your current year, 2021. Yeah, that's an exceptional circumstance because that's what the rent board has held. The rent board has held that to be an exceptional circumstance. Then you look at the rent and you see, you can use number 3 to see if it tracked CPI. And if it disproportionately did not track CPI, they would likely satisfy number 2. So not a lot of information needs to be provided. You know, you give your sworn statement and whatever other testimonies you can offer to prove up your first prong, and your second prong, CPI is readily available. You know, you can just go online to figure out your CPIs, and the hearing examiner does your CPI comparison for you, because remember, the hearing examiner has to consider 1 through 5. So even if you're unsavvy as a landlord and maybe you chose option 1 and it wasn't your best option, it doesn't matter. We go through the whole 5 lists. Whichever one's the most persuasive, that's the one we hang our hat on. Okay, next slide. All right, so if the landlord successfully demonstrates that 1, the landlord set base year rents based on exceptional circumstances, and 2, the resulting rents were disproportionately low, the landlord is entitled to an adjustment in their base year gross income. That adjustment is reflected by artificially increasing the rents reported in the base year, which results in a higher base year net operating income. The hearing examiner has a discretion to decide how such adjustment in the base year rents occur, but all evidence relied upon to adjust the base year rents must be reasonable and substantiated by the evidence contained in the record. Which is a fancy way of just saying, once you prove an exceptional circumstance and your rents, your incomes were disproportionately low, your base year gross income will be adjusted. And remember, and that's going to impact your base year net operating income, right? So your base year rent income will be higher, your expenses will stay the same, and so your resulting net operating income in your base year will be higher, which would impact the comparison between your current year, in a positive way for landlords, because a lower base year net operating income is harder to overcome for a landlord than a higher base year net operating income. And then okay, yeah, that's good. Next slide. So here's a quick example. So consider a situation where a landlord's M&OI petition demonstrates a base year gross income of $12,000 and expenses of $6,000. And this example assumes no inflation has occurred between the base year and the current year. It's just to make calculations a lot easier for example purposes. That will never be the case in the real world, but just in this hypothetical, we're going to assume no inflation. So the resulting base year net operating income would be $6,000, because you take the gross income and you subtract its expenses from that, and you get $6,000. So within that same petition, it is determined that the current year gross income is $17,400 and the expenses are $6,000. The resulting current year net operating income would be $11,400. So if you compared, and remember, we're just going to assume no inflation, so don't worry about the inflation. So if you compare the current year net operating income to the base year, you subtract $6,000 from $11,400, and that results in a positive $5,400. So it would appear that the landlord is receiving a fair return, because not only has the landlord maintained the base year net operating income of $6,000, in the current year, they've exceeded it by $5,400, right? Okay, I hope that's pretty straightforward. So next slide. So suppose in that same petition, suppose a landlord presents evidence that they only rented to close friends and family members and charge low rents because they want to give their family members a deal. Assuming that the basis for setting rent satisfies the exceptional circumstance prong, and that the set rents in the base year were disproportionately low, the landlord would be entitled to an adjustment in the base year gross income or rents. Using the best evidence available, the hearing examiner would determine base year amounts that were set based on general market conditions and make an adjustment in the landlord's base year rents to reflect those rents set based on general market conditions. And I just want to be extremely clear, this does not mean the base year gross rents are adjusted to reflect market rents in the base year. Rather it means that the rents are adjusted to reflect rents of other comparable apartments that were set based on general market conditions. It's not, so people get confused, they come in, they petition, they want their base years to reflect market rents, and they say, no, look at what these people were making over here, and I was so much lower than that. Yeah, that's not, no, you demonstrate your exceptional circumstance, we look at it, if it's disproportionately low, we adjusted, but the adjustment is not going to get your base year income or rents to market level rents of the base year. You're not entitled to that. You're entitled to something else, and to rents that reflect general market conditions. And oftentimes you might ask, well, how do you do that? Well, sometimes we've received petitions where it just simply tracks CPI, the inflation. So we give you the culmination of the last like 10 years of an inflationary increase, gets you pretty high, right? Or if you hadn't taken any rent increases, or some people have submitted comparables. And I think it's the rent board is considered an appeal with the comparable before. And we look at comps in similarly situated neighborhoods and to see whether or not, what the rents will look like there. And then we have it reflect those rents. Okay, next slide. So once the hearing examiner has made a determination, and if you're entitled to this adjustment in your base year, then the hearing examiner adjusts the landlord's base year rents to reflect those based on general market conditions. Let's return to the hypothetical. Assume the average base year rents charged based on general market conditions was $1,500. The hearing examiner would then substitute $1,500 times 12 to determine the base year income, right? And that would give you $18,000, right? So your expenses would stay the same. Your expenses before your base year was adjusted was $6,000. And after your base year rental income is adjusted, it's going to stay the same, $6,000. What's going to change is your base year income, which is now $18,000. So your base year net operating income is going to be $12,000, which is $18,000 minus $6,000. So it's $12,000, 2 times higher than what it would otherwise be. So you compare your new base year net operating income of $12,000 to your current year net operating income of $11,400, and the landlord is no longer receiving a fair return on their investment, but is below $600 below maintaining their base year net operating income. As a result, the landlord is entitled to a rent increase, and that's how the base year works. The base year adjustments work, and it keeps in mind all the things we've said in terms of what the ordinance would have us do, having landlords receive rent increases above the AGA only when they've demonstrated it's necessary for a fair return, but also keeping in mind that the purpose, the tension in the purpose statement that we started with, that the board is charged by the voters to control rents and evictions to the greatest extent allowable by law, while ensuring a landlord receives a fair return on their investment. Next slide. All right, we're almost finished, so bear with me. I'm sorry, I'm tired of speaking too, so I can't wait. What if I don't have base year information? So this is to Board Member Connor's question. We briefly went over it, but let's just look specifically at the regulation so we know it exists and it's out there. Regulation 905-6E, like elephant. If the landlord does not have the base year operating expense data, it shall be presumed that the operating expenses increased by the percentage increase in CPI between the base year and the current year. And this presumption is subject to the exception that specific operating expenses shall be adjusted by other amounts when alternate percentage adjustments are supported by a preponderance of the evidence. Now, that just means that you take your expenses, whatever your expenses are in your current year, and the hearing examiner will just essentially adjust them down by inflation up to 2015. That's permitted by the regulations, unless there is a specific adjustment known, then you use the more specific adjustment. Next slide. Okay. How do capital improvements impact MNOI? Next slide. So the regulation is in this case is being modified by the rent ordinance, and I'll just explain. First, you should know that the regulation states operating expenses include amortized costs of capital improvements plus interest allowance to cover the amortization of those costs. For purposes of this section, a capital improvement shall be any improvement to a unit or property which materially adds to the value of the property, appreciably prolongs its useful life, or adapts it to a new use and has a useful life of more than 1 year and a direct cost of $250 or more per unit affected. Now, this definition is being modified, or at least you should know it's being modified by the rent ordinance, because the rent ordinance specifically states that or requires that improvements, capital improvements, be distinguishable from ordinary repair, replacement, and maintenance, and the improvement be necessary to bring the property into compliance or maintain compliance with applicable local code requirements for affecting health and safety. So in other words, your capital improvement cannot be an ordinary repair, replacement, or maintenance, and it has to be it has to be the type of improvement that is necessary to bring your property either into compliance or to comply with local laws that impact health and safety. Okay, with all the other stuff the regs have added in on that. Now, the amortization part, the very first part of the regulation is interesting. Some of you might not know this, but this is how it works. If you have a capital improvement, it operates just like an expense. You have a sheet that we give you, you put your expenses in there, right? So you have a capital improvement, you incur an expense. Now, before you put your expenses in there, this ordinance or this regulation allows you to inflate your own expenses by an interest rate. And the interest rate we use is a primary mortgage survey plus 2%, right? And it's pretty much the interest rates that Freddie Mac and Freddie Mac and the other big bank, Federal Bank, releases for interest rates on mortgage. So let's just say your capital improvement costs you $10,000. Well, before you submit that as an expense, we look at the primary mortgage survey rate. Let's just assume it's 5% interest rate, and we add 2% onto that. No, let's not use 5. Let's use 8%, and we add 2% onto that. So it's 10%. It's easier number to deal with, right? So you take your $10,000 of expenses, capital improvement expenses, you multiply that by 10%, right? And you get $1,000, and you add that into your capital improvement expense. So instead of submitting a $10,000 expense, you're going to submit an $11,000 expense. That's an incentive, I suppose. I'm not sure why that's in there, but I think it's an incentive to have you do capital improvements and to ensure that you earn more money on your investment than you otherwise would. Now, you have to amortize the costs, which essentially means you have to spread the cost. Cost across time. Otherwise, you'll be passing through your entire expense of $10K or however much you spent, and that's going to probably result in rent shock. So what you do, we have a chart. You take your $11K and you look at the chart and see where your repair falls on, and it gives you the years that you need to amortize it over. Let's imagine you have to amortize your $11,000 over a 10-year period. So you just take 11,000, you divide that by 10, which is the amount of years, and you get 1,100. That $1,100 is what you include as part of your expenses. So when you get your rent increase approved, your cost of capital improvement, it's built into your rent increase, and it lasts for the amortized time, the 10-year period. After 10 years, just that portion of the rent increase drops off. The remaining portion is obviously permanent. So that's why amortization is very important, and that's why it's in the regs. Next slide. There's one other aspect of capital improvement. It's the anticipated capital improvements. So you don't even have to have done the capital improvement. You can go into the office, you can submit an M&OI petition, and under it, you can fill out the anticipated capital improvement portion. And in that portion, you just anticipate what you think your costs are going to be. And the hearing examiner will look at your petition with these anticipated capital improvements and will conditionally grant your petition without you having done any capital improvements. But you're not allowed to take the resulting rent increase from that conditional grant until you show proof of completion of that capital improvement. And you have 24 months to complete the capital improvement. That's 2 years. You can request that you get an extension. Maybe there's something happened with the project, delayed in permits or what have you, and you can get that extended beyond the 2-year period. So, I mean, so again, I think it's very interesting. A lot, and I've done workshops on this. I would expect people to know, but maybe they don't know. But this is a way to get your foot in the door to know whether or not you're going to receive a rent increase even before you do the improvement, to know if the improvement's even worth it to you. That's what the board had in mind when they adopted this particular provision. Next slide. So finally, I want to point out the capital improvements in vacancy. I think there's been some talk about vacancies. So any unit which received a vacancy rent increase pursuant to Costa-Hawkins, that's just Costa-Hawkins right there, within a 1-year period to the fair return application shall be ineligible for rent increase for the portion of any rent increase based on the cost of proposed capital improvement. So if you got your rent, if you got a vacancy decontrolling event, it's going to nullify part of that capital improvement cost that you otherwise would be able to pass through. And before I end, I will say, first of all, thank you. I know it's been a while. Thank you to the public. Thank you for the questions. I just want to note that COVID obviously has impacted a lot of people. We've done workshops in the past. I've been talking to Nicholas about starting them up. I think board member Connor made that suggestion last meeting. So we've been discussing that and getting that prepared for the public and for the board members. I want you to know that we've done them in the past. I've done them in the past. They were not very well attended. I think there was only like 3 or 4 people who attended. And they're usually the landlords who are more vigilant, so they know a lot more. And so I'm not sure how else to get the word out. If you have suggestions, let me know. But we do e-blasts, we do mailers, but I'm more than happy to give a training or public training on it. Lastly, I'll say the pandemic has impacted a lot of people. Despite that, I had our hearing examiner pull up or inform me how many petitions they received on MNOI during the very beginning of COVID and to present, and how many were granted. We did receive a couple of MNOIs. So landlords knew, some landlords at least knew to file their MNOI. Some of them included capital improvements, and I think they were all granted, but one might be pending still, I'm not sure. But that's an update for you all. And with that, next slide. Thank you very much.
In that case, Ms. Shaw, would you please call the speakers who are remaining?
Sure, I was just contacting one that fell off, so I was just trying to reach out to see if he's going to come back on. So yes, the first speaker, I'll unmute Mr. Jimmy Smith. Mr. Jimmy Smith, you have 2 minutes to speak. Let me share my screen real fast with the timer. Jimmy, go ahead. Mr. Smith?
How about now? Can you hear me okay?
We hear you fine.
Great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the great refresher on the MNOI program. Great refresher, but having said that, I know towards the end there in Charles's final words regarding the presentation, he mentioned about a 24-month extension to submit an MNOI package. And that's why I have been attending all these meetings for the last 4 months to see about an exception to have my MNOI $500,000 capital improvement reviewed. Due to timing, if it does, based on tonight's information, it does fall on the 24 months extension to get everything in. And due to COVID, which impacted all of us, and even you, the city rent board, to where we couldn't have the sit down meetings and go over things of that nature and or get all of our questions addressed. So I'm here again requesting direction on what I need to do to have my $500,000 capital improvement package reviewed, and how do we compare it? It was submitted with the current year of 2021, and it was all blown back to me shortly after that. And so hopefully after this meeting, or even maybe at this meeting, I can have get some final direction of what I need to do to start recouping some of this massive money that we put into this property for health and safety primarily, and start collecting the additional rent that should fall under that. It will fall under the MONI package with all the full documentation. So I look forward to hearing about that. Thank you for your time.
The next speaker is Ilana Clark. Ilana, you have 2 minutes to speak. Let me start this time. Ilana, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
So what I'm hearing loud and clear from everyone involved in this process, the housing providers, the staff, Cynthia herself, is that this process is incredibly onerous. It's laborious, it's time consuming, it's bureaucratic, it's unnecessarily so. The difficulty of this process means that the people who are willing to embark on this process are housing providers who already have a really, really obvious case. And that's why you have this very high rate of approval, because people who don't have a really obvious and exceptional case and really need these raises are not going to bother. And I'll tell you what, I took one look at that 20-page form and I said to myself, I will never go through the stress of that. I will never put myself through that. It's ridiculous. And it's not just 20 pages, it's 20 pages, each page of which asks for more documentation about this, that, and the other. It is crazy. So I urge this board to revisit and streamline this process. I also urge this board to break capital improvements out to a completely different methodology, if that's what you want to call it, that does not mix it up with all this historical and whatever. If you, as a regulatory body, want to encourage housing providers to do this, then capital improvements needs to be its own thing. Thank you.
All right.
All right, I was mute. We have one more speaker, Tuan. Go. Let me find him. Tuan, can you hear us?
Yes, I'd like to just dovetail with the last speaker and emphasize this. I read through the MNOI process for ferry turn, and it is really extremely convoluted. And I think if you just look at the number of people that file for this each year, I did this just rough back of the envelope calculation. If there are 12 applications per year and there are about 20,000 residential rental housing units in Richmond, that represents less than 0.1% of the rental housing. And that just speaks to how onerous and convoluted this process and how prohibitive this process is. You know, and you would think more people would file for a fair return, but I think
Tuan? I don't know what happened. He's must have faded out. Oh. Yeah, I don't know what happened. He dropped off chair, so.
All right. In that case, if he comes back on and wants the additional 1 minute, go ahead and let us know, and then we'll provide that to him.
Will do.
It was just about a minute when he dropped, I believe.
Yes. Okay, will do. That's
All righty.
Until he rejoins.
All righty, then let's open this up to the members of the board. Any comments, any statements, any questions? Ms. Johnson, then we'll go to Mr. Vasilis.
So I'm definitely hearing that the process is long and painstaking, but the speaker who commented earlier was able to complete the process in 6 months, and so we're being asked to approve a 2-year time period. Is that correct?
No, this item, this is a return item from the board that directed us to come back for a study session, and the board will have discussions on potential amendments to regulation, if any. So.
But is it about the time period for the petitions? They could have more time to fill out the.
I think it's whatever you want it to be, really. It's very broad. I think the impetus of the discussion was, I think the prior speaker who filed, or something happened during COVID and maybe he was unable to file, or he filed and I don't know. I think Board Member Vasilis can probably speak better to it because it was his initial item that brought us here. But I think it was allowing the landlords who filed MNOI during COVID, or who failed to file MNOI during COVID, to allow them to file the petition as timely or something like that.
Okay.
I could be wrong though, so Board Member Vasilis he has his hand up, so I'm sure he'll clarify.
All right, Mr. Vasilis.
Yeah, for this particular item, my thought was to allow landlords to carry costs from years previous to the current year and include them in the current year for MNOI analysis. And in this case, the basis, was provoked from COVID-related restraints. But I actually think in general, there should be a much greater grace period because projects take a long time. The process itself takes a long time. I think there should be some more leeway that we allow for here. And I think I wanted to ask, I don't know if it's a ready slide, but I was even having a hard time finding where the time restriction was in Regulation 905, where it was outlined, aside from just like very, specific terminology about current year, which it might be, a little hard to understand for the average person.
That is a time restriction. Your current year,
right?
You're comparing your current year. Your base year is always 15, and so you're comparing your current year, which is a preceding year from the date you filed.
Yeah. So, but I'm just saying, in terms of clarity for the average person, it should say, if you do not file for a petition within this 1 year, you are not eligible for any increase, something along those lines, because even reading through it, it's pretty dense. So I don't think it's that unreasonable to allow for more leeway, have like a multi-year ability to carry costs over into a current year. I don't know what the rest of the board thinks.
Quite frankly, I understand why you're asking for that kind of fluidity, but I also understand what kind of chaos it creates, simply because you do need a firm set of time for what's going to happen, but then you have to go back 1 year for that to influence that present year, which is actually the year past. So it gets a little confusing. I understand that, but one of the speakers at one point during the last time we spoke, she wanted to carry over more than 1 year and being able to add that in to a combined situation, which to me only adds chaos to just trying to get anything together, because then it becomes even more mobile than it is. So whether or not we wish to go back in and look at other items that were brought up tonight, the more immediate one was the timing and in terms of Jimmy's request, because that was the first one that we saw. And I'm sorry that I don't have his last name in front of me. But in that case, I know that at different times he tried to or at least I believe from what I read, that he tried to submit and got part of the process done. And then apparently, for whatever reason, the process stopped. And I'm not allocating blame because it stopped, but I'm saying I'd like to know what that process was that he went through. But what bothers me, and I still have to go back to this, is that anytime we do anything that creates an exception, we have created a whole new and very open to interpretation set of rules. So I just would hope that not that we throw this out, I'm not saying that at all, but that we're very, very careful about what we do and how the whole thing holds together, especially something as important as the timeline, because that is how we allocate not only the AGA, but we allocate where the costs end up. And a sliding scale, it may not seem like the fairest thing to do, but the sliding scale adds almost an impossibility of cutting it off and saying, this is your time frame. So, and yes, I understand the pandemic gave us all, made doing the art of doing business far more difficult. But that is part of the process, unfortunately. So I would look to the other speakers. Michael, I see your hand up again.
Yeah, I just had a just quick question for Charles.
Sure, of course.
I thought that the capital improvements were amortized over a specific period, and then after that period, everything reverts. Is that correct?
No, not everything reverts, just the portion of the rent increase that was attributable to the capital.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The amortization of that capital improvement, let's say for 10 years, year 11, it reverts back to what the rent was adjusted for inflation or whatnot. It removes that component of the capital expenditure from the person's rent.
Yes, to the second half, because I don't know what, the basis of the rent increase might have been more than just capital improvements. So yes, to your second half, that it removes the award based on the capital improvement portion.
Okay.
So you realize your value, and your value, again, because you're receiving interest rate, you're receiving an interest rate plus the PMS interest rate plus 2%, you received, you're receiving the value of your investment plus whatever percentage on top of that you get from the interest rates.
Okay.
My question, and Alana will get right back to you on this, but my question then ties into Mr. Vasilas's question. There is nothing that would preclude the owner of continuing on with other capital improvements that might have a varying time for expiration.
That's right.
So with any type of property, you're always investing, hopefully, as a landlord, in bringing the property up to date in some manner. Ms. Connor, I believe you next.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate this very long presentation, because I know that it can't be easy to give, and it's quite confusing just to listen. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate all the comments that we've gotten so far. This helps me to understand it a little bit better. I think I have two questions, and maybe it's a question and a comment, we'll see. For the capital improvements, or any of these increases that are above AGA, if you bump up against that 15%, you're basically rolling over increases year over year, presuming that the same tenant remains in possession. Is that correct?
No, well, so presuming, so different from assuming. So if no, there's not a presumption there, because if the tenant vacates, then you're no longer entitled to the rent increase on that unit, obviously, because you have the vacancy decontrol event, and you could just set that unit's rent to whatever you want to.
And that then is reflected on a form that the owner files with the rent board, right?
I don't think so. I think that's just you and your personal business in terms of what you want to put your rents at after your tenant's gone.
Okay, got it. So I want to circle back to the issue that I thought we were going to be covering tonight, which is we've got people who, and Mr. Smith, I think is his name, who are expressing concerns about their inability to get a petition reviewed because there have been delays with COVID and our offices have been closed. And so if we're dealing with someone like Mr. Smith, who would have had to use 2021 as his current year, 2015 as his base year, and he would have to have completed all the work within the past 2 years. So it would have been 2019 to 2021. I don't know where the problem is. So I'm confused about why he's not able to get his petition reviewed.
So I can't speak too specifically about Mr. Smith because I tend to stay out of the petition stuff just in case it's appealed. But what I do know is, and I'm sure Mr. Smith can probably, it might be better for you to put him on. He can speak for himself. But what I do know is he filed, I'm not sure if his current year is 2021. That means he would have filed in 2022 and it wouldn't be a problem. I think what he meant is, although he said current year 2021, I think he meant 2020. And I think he may have tried to file, I think he actually did file, and he had completed his capital improvements maybe. Okay, I see Cindy shaking her head. So I think he did complete the capital improvements when he filed, but when he filed, the petition was filed incorrectly. There was insufficient documentation, inadequate documentation, and there were several emails sent between him and staff where staff was encouraging him to provide that documentation. And one of the emails I did see, he indicated that, okay, I'm just gonna withdraw this petition for now, and I'll refile at a later time. So he withdrew his petition. That's my understanding, but you might wanna get his perspective because you might have a totally different perspective.
He put it on hold. He said he would like to put it on hold until he can file, till, and I informed him that we can't put it on hold. He could just refile when he's ready.
And was
problematic?
And when he did, that's what happened.
Because if you put it on hold, that would remain active, correct? But to withdraw, then it's a whole new petition.
So that was my follow-up question. Was it dismissed or was it withdrawn? I don't know this.
It was dismissed because we can't put it on hold. We don't put petitions on hold. If you can't file, we tell you, we advise you to file when you're ready. And in this case, it was, he said that he didn't have a proof of service, so it wasn't complete anyway. And I tried to reach out to him to ask him to fill out the proof of service. So even if he did, he would have had to submit all the documents, and he did not do that. A petition is not complete without the proof of service. The tenants, you would have to show that the tenants were served.
All right. Ms. Connor, I think that you said you had 2 questions.
It turned out it was a question and a comment, which I warned you about. So.
Oh, okay. I didn't want to overlook you.
I am concerned, though, that if Mr. Smith was told he should, file at some later point, if that later point fell within the time frame where we were not in our offices full time due to COVID, if he needed assistance, wanted to come in and sit down with staff like Mr. Oceanuga has shared staff is available to do, it may mean that we need to make an exception to reflect some leeway for folks who have petitions who maybe that haven't been fully considered as a result of this 2-year, unprecedented pandemic, so that no one's rights are unfairly jeopardized as a result, because it would have been out of his control if staff wasn't available in office.
But Nick could probably chime in on this,
Yeah.
because we actually hold Zoom appointments.
Yeah.
Before you
Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Before you chime in, I just want to say, Board Member Connor, I think those are prudent statements. I'll let Nick talk about, because I just don't want this to devolve, especially because Mr. Smith is not here to he is here, but he's not able to present his side. I just don't want this to devolve into, he's wrong, I'm right kind of thing. What I will say is, I did a lot of research on this particular, not in his case, but generally our operations, and we were fully operational despite the pandemic. There were landlords who came in and were able to file their petition and were able to receive rent increases that were later put on hold, including the landlord who spoke on today. I have grave concerns about adjusting the MNOI regulations, but your suggestion gives me less heartburn. You could probably, you could probably, have something where through resolution, it adopts a temporary regulation that allows for landlords who have filed maybe during the pandemic and didn't have their petition heard for whatever reason, that they can now file. And we would have to figure out how that works. I think you wouldn't use you wouldn't roll in expenses from prior year into this current year, because that just wouldn't be, that's just not it. But perhaps you could consider, let's just say for Mr. Smith, for instance, if his current year is 2020, we just used the year that otherwise would have been his current year, 2020, and then we compare that to 15, and wherever it falls, it falls. Maybe you have a rate that definitely gives me less heartburn than getting in and tinkering with the whole.
My goal is to give you as much heartburn as.
Oh, wait a minute, come on. Hold it right there, everybody.
Less heartburn, less heartburn.
All right, but I'll go for that one. Now, I'm going to go to Mr. Trainer next, and then Ms. Johnson, and then Mr. Vasilas.
Yeah, so we do offer, thank you, Board Chair Finley. We do offer, and as during the pandemic, we have continued to counsel landlords and tenants by phone and by Zoom and by email. We do continue to offer assistance with filing petitions. When we do that, we often recommend that we set up a Zoom appointment. And I've personally assisted several petitioners with, by sharing the screen and saying, okay, this section is for, this is explaining the various sections of each petition. So our counselors do perform assistance, and I just want the board to know that it's not like we haven't been available. I do understand though that during the pandemic, people had a lot of complexities in their lives, and it was very difficult for people to stay on top of everything. So, the board can certainly have the discretion, according to Charles, to consider that possible exception due to the pandemic. But we have been open and we have been available in assisting folks.
Thank you, Mr. Traylor. Ms. Johnson?
So I was just wondering if it's possible to make the entire process less cumbersome, maybe cut the 20 pages down to 15 or maybe even 10 pages for everyone, for all of them, not just for one or two, but.
I'm certainly open to looking at ways to make the form easier to understand and read. So we'll put that on our things to discuss, internally as staff to see if we can make the MNOI application more streamlined and easier to follow.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Vasilas.
So a couple of comments, I guess. One, I think Mr. Smith pointed out that we allow for a 24-month extension on work that hasn't been performed yet, but we don't allow for an extension on work that has already been performed and paid for. Is that correct?
Not an extension. It's you filed your petition. The difference is this, if you've never filed a petition, you're in a different boat than if you filed your petition. And according to regulations, you've actually filed an MNOI petition and you've filled it all out, your expenses, your income, and there's a portion for your anticipated capital improvements. So we evaluate everything. We assume that your anticipated costs that you put in there are going to be correct. And we conditionally grant it. And then it's paused. It's not an extension. It's a pause of your rent increase that you're entitled to. And we pause it for 2 years until you can show us that you actually receive those expenses by way of capital improvement. So it's different.
So, but I think, I mean, I'm just trying to make him connect him a little bit because he did file for his petition. He asked for it to be on hold, which would essentially open the door for an extension, right? And perhaps maybe in that time period, things are on hold until he has his petition completed. Something that's similar to that seems pretty logical to me.
I mean, again, it's not an extension, and unless he had filled out that part, you know, first of all, it seems like his petition was inadequate and later dismissed. If it were adequate and he filled out that anticipated capital improvement part, and we would have granted it, we wouldn't have waited for him to give us more information. We would have just simply granted the petition, and he just wouldn't have been able to take a rent increase. We would have conditionally granted it, sorry, and until he demonstrated the costs, you know. But to Board Member Connor's earlier point, and you may be saying the same thing, because I don't want to use Mr. Smith. It's not his hearing, and he's not, you know, he's not here to present his side. And so, you know, we can use it as an example, but I'm hesitant to single him out in that way. And I think if you want to make a rule similar to what Board Member Connor spoke about, where you're just generally impacting landlords during COVID, you're not changing the MNOI process. All you're saying is, hey, if you tried to file a petition, recognizing the impact COVID had, recognizing that we've changed our office style, if you tried to file a petition, if you can show proof that you've tried to file a petition during the local state of emergency, local and state emergency due to COVID, then we're going to extend your filing date, and you're able to file still. However, you know, then we'll just specify though that your current year is not the year you filed in. It's going to be the year where you tried to file your petition. That's why connecting the proof of trying to file is important. So that way we address some of the speaker's issues, but we don't open the door to floodgates for people just to come in, right? And so that's the balance that I heard from Board Member Connor's comments. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Board Member Vasilas, I think that kind of is in line, at least in part, in what you've been saying.
It is, yeah.
And if I could just jump in, I'm sorry, Board Member Vasilas.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that we don't want to use Mr. Smith as the example necessarily. And I think that making an exception, a COVID-related exception, is something that we can do to accomplish a goal for this limited number of petitioners, which was what I recall from our regular meeting was really important to Mr. Vasilas. For us to go through the process of changing how MNOIs are going to be done, regulation, modifications, adjustments, et cetera, is a much longer process, and it will not have the same immediate effect for those petitioners who are trying to get something done and filed. And so for me, I would like to see us, give some direction to staff to make an exception to the rule, a COVID-related exception for the time frame related to filing, rather than taking on the task of, at this moment, changing the entire MNOI procedure. But that would be my preference. So I just want to share that with the board members so that they can think about how much time they want to spend on this tonight, because we do have a 3-hour limit and it's 12 minutes till. And how many more special meetings we would need to have the kind of immediate impact we might need to address to deal with COVID while it's still, for those constituents who have petitions that are either pending or would be, but for this problem.
Sounds like up for a motion.
Excuse me, Miss Johnson, I saw you got very active there for a moment. Were you getting ready to say something?
No, I was just agreeing with Board Member Connor.
Okay, all right. Ms. Mishek, we haven't heard from you recently. Did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
I'm just processing all of the information. Thank you.
Okay. My own feeling on it at this point is, again, although I see the benefit of perhaps a one-time exception, I don't like opening that door. But I would consider it if I saw what lengths Mr. Smith took in terms of doing what he needed to do to satisfy. You know, I understand what COVID did to all of us in our schedules, but I also understand just saying, hey, I'll do it later. I just don't want to deal with it. Yeah, what the hell? So, and that is not a way to go about trying to run the type of operation that we are trying to run with a very capable staff. So I look to everybody else for their guidance and their input on this. But I'm not comfortable with the way it stands right now, doing anything that would create the path to the exception. Because if we do it for one, we do it for all. Especially not with more information at my fingertips to say, yeah, this guy really, really did try.
Well, Chair
Because
Finley, we can give oh, I'm sorry, Board Member Vasilas, you had your hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, if there, would it alleviate some of that concern if it was, you know, a very set time frame? You know, it's not like just like, oh, an exception, and then, you know, 10 years from now, someone's going to make the same exception. It's just, if it was finite, would that help? Because because the petition was initially filed, at least, or tried to file during this time period. So I don't think it would open the door for someone 10 years from now to go, oh, by the way, back in COVID, I put the roof on and I want my adjustment. You know, I don't think it opens the door for that type of issue, but I could be wrong.
Well,
And Board Member or Chair Finley, just to clarify, just to add a little clarity to what Board Member Vasilas said, and this is more of a Board Member Connor's proposal, it would be tied to the period of the local emergency and state emergency due to COVID. So that obviously has an ending date, maybe, who knows. And then it would also be further narrowed to just those landlords who attempted to file during that time. So you'd probably only get I don't even know, maybe 2, maybe 3. I don't know. I think the number is probably less than 5. And so the impact of that, you probably wouldn't have too much of an impact. But I think that's some background.
Thank you, Charles. I'm just remembering the other lady who's standing in the background saying, but he died, and I want to add what we did the year before to this as an exception. And having worked in planning for all those years, or not worked in planning, but been on the commission, you know, I've seen what the exception does. So I've said what I'm going to say.
So Chair Finley, what is the next step here? Are we to make a motion to give staff instructions on one thing or another? Either we're going to ask them to do something or tell them we don't want to be bothered. Like where are we now?
Well, anyone on the board can, of course, make a motion and put it to a vote. That is our normal. I would, you know, I'll certainly entertain that. I think it depends on how carefully you craft the motion.
Well, I was going to make one, but after you said that.
Well, no, come on now. I'm not, don't blame that on me. I mean, that sits with you.
So what I would like to see is let's see, I'd like to make a motion to instruct staff to draft an exception, a COVID-related exception to the time, to the MNOI petition process that would allow petitioners who have already filed petitions during COVID, but have not had a decision made, be granted some additional time to complete their applications. The end.
Okay. I would simply ask that part of that consideration would be that according to Ms. Shaw, who said that there was one piece of paper that she asked for, which was the receipt for the receipt of some sort of paperwork, that he had to agree that he had received something from the rent board. That's what I'm trying to get to. And he refused to do it.
I don't want that friendly amendment, if you don't mind, because it deals with one specific petitioner. And maybe the motion itself, with the exception would have to take into consideration whether why it was denied, but I'm not sure. I don't want to do the exact language that you're proposing. I'm not opposed to a friendly amendment, but I don't want to make the amendment such that.
And I didn't expect that you would, but I just see it. Okay, if that's your motion, then we can certainly, Charles, is that enough information for you to create something?
Yes, I understand the motion, but it just perhaps this is helpful, Chair Finley and Board Member Connor, because Board Member Connor seems to be open to a friendly amendment that's not just so individualized. Perhaps you have a due diligence standard, right? Like if you filed it with due diligence or something like that, or there was good cause for you to have not done something, you know, as reviewed by the board or something, then it's fine. I just don't want, if you have a standard, I just prefer, if you do include a due diligence standard or a good cause standard, I prefer it be determined by the board and not staff. Because if staff determines it and we determine that it's not good cause, then the landlord's further delayed and you got to appeal it and it goes to the board. I much rather it just go to the board, almost like our rent, how we waive rent late charges or late payments. We give you a little summary, and that way it might suffice, Chair Finley, some of your concerns, because you'll have all of the prior communications that the staff had with the particular individual, and it might satisfy Board Member Vasilas's concerns, because it does still open up an avenue for people who have filed and who haven't been able to, do their thing. It might open up an avenue for them to have their stuff here. So anyways, in terms of a friendly amendment, maybe a due diligence standard or a good cause standard might be helpful.
Ms. Mishek? Yeah,
I just want to note this meeting ends in 3 minutes unless someone votes to extend. And I actually can't, I've delayed going to work half an hour. I'm sorry, so I won't be able to stay. So I suggest that we take a vote, unless people don't care if I'm here for the vote, which I don't think is necessarily true. So maybe I can, I don't know if this is possible, but maybe we can do a friendly amendment to Connors's motion that with the due diligence standard to be determined by the board at a later date. Can that be done, or do you need the due diligence thing now, Charles?
Oh, no, it's up to you all. I would use probably the word good cause because it has a definition and it's easier to figure out, but I will understand the friendly amendment if accepted. I will understand what that meant.
Okay. All right.
It's accepted.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think we need a second.
And
Second.
I'm sorry, Ms. Connor, did you say you accepted the friendly amendment?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you. May we have a second, please?
I'll second.
All right. May we have a vote, please? Ms. Shaw?
Board Member Connor,
Yes.
Board Member Johnson,
Yes,
Board Member Vasilas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Mishek,
No.
and Chair Finley.
No.
Motion passes with Vice Chair Mishek voting no and Chair Finley voting no.
Thank you. At this point, do we have any reports of officers?
Reports of officers.
Mr. Traylor?
And no reports of officers.
Okay. Then in order to end this meeting in a timely fashion, I adjourn this meeting, and I believe that it is 7:59 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Vice Chair Mishak, for staying. Well, she didn't stay.
She had to go to work. All right. Take care, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much.
Right.